Good morning. I see everyone's still checking in, so we'll do some introductions. Appreciate everyone for joining the training for the 2020 specification and details changes that we made. My name is Jim Osborne. We were myself, Danny, and we've been heavily involved in doing the training. We wanted to also extend thank you to all the sections that helped, the traffic section, lab, construction, consultants that were aiding us with the details, the specs, Tron or GPI, WRA, everything of that sense. And we do have quite a few participants. We've got participants in-house, consultants, in-house DelDOT. We have our consultants from engineers to we also have the contractors availability and others in that sense. So I definitely appreciate everyone's participation. We kind of want to get into the general gist of things, a little bit of housekeeping. This is a digital platform. Sorry, this is a digital platform. Hopefully you can hear me well. Sorry, we're doing a little bit of technology. And we have in the room, we'll be passing the presentation off to Barry Bent with GPI to help us with the specs this morning. Mike Nallman with GPI also to introduce kind of the MASH barrier changes that were made, and Adam Weiser with WRA to be able to go into some of the barrier stuff. This morning we're getting into the specs more as they intertwine with the details, and discuss general topic discussions on that. Again, we're doing this, and there's questions and answers that are available. There's a Q&A button. There will not be a raised hand feature for this particular training, but we do want to be able to answer the questions. We have a few folks in here. We have Danny, John from engineering support. They're going to be able to help assist with those questions. And at the end, we want to leave a little bit of time, if we have availability of time, to kind of go over questions, answers in general. We can post them later. We're recording this, so we do want to post this online. It will be on the DRC, Design Resource Center, and that will be available for later use for references. One of the things that we definitely want to entail is that this is just a general brief introduction to changes that were made. Please do read the specs, read the details, and plans. This is not a one-size-fits-all. Everything is going to be unique in that fashion. So this morning, I will be kind of introducing the 100 section up to the 500. Like I said, Barry will take over from there and go into starting with 600s for the structures. And then Adam will also be introducing the guardrail, barrier, and traffic items. And then we'll kind of finish up with Barry on the 900 environmental section. The afternoon will be details, so just a brief kind of getting into the details, the MASH, compliance to guardrail, changes that were made there, and the requirements that we had in that token. So just to recap, again, appreciate it. It looks like we've got most of the participants here. Please ask any questions as we go along, and we'll try to do our best to answer them at the end. All right. So this morning, Generally, in the 2020, the differences that were made. The layout of the manual itself, we're going to kind of get into the formatting, some of the between 2016 2020. Also, the general format of what we have. So to outline, we have the navigation, like we just said, voice and mode, more concise language, lists, and references. All that we'll get into a little bit later, but start off online, everything can be found. So we're doing everything digital now. We want to be able to present this in the digital platform for all folks, whether you're using the iPads for inspection, the computers at the desk, it's there. So please do be mindful that we have the memos. Online we have the provisions. We also have all the items. So if you need what you need, should be there for the standard items provisions as well. And the memo is a brief introduction to what has changed in the 2020 specifications, but again, it's just a very brief executive summary of what we have. Navigation of it, again, digital. We did change a few things up from the 16s, from the traditional in the fashion, and you'll see, we'll go through one example, specifically in the 401. And if you're on the web, you can put it into a PDF format. They have tags that can be presented. So from the left side of the screen, you can actually navigate through the sections. You also can go into table of contents, and it's an inner hyperlink to allow you to get into the section specifically that you're wanting to. As you see, the generals are broken up a little bit more, the 100 section, and then the other sections are a little more broad, but they're all formatted the same so that they start off with descriptions and end with basis of payment. So there's there's ways of going about that. Some are one pagers, some are multiple pages, and they kind of make that sense come together. Sorry. So format. Start off with a title, trying to be uniform amongst the sections and the items. So this is an item format. You have the descriptions, short and brief, the materials of what's involved with that particular item, and methods as we broke those down, method of measurement, and then basis of payment. One of the things that we did try to implement was to remove the incorrect descriptions within the section. So if it's a payment item, it's in the payment section. If it's a construction item, it's in the construction section. So there was some bleeding in between those two that we tried to eliminate to make it more concise, clear, easier to find. Kind of a description of section 1.1. So in 401.1 description, we had a little more language in the 16. If you look at the bottom of the screen, it does show that this work consists of providing, placing, compacting, bituminous pavement. Some of the other items are more generalizations. They're all part of construction. They're not necessary. It became unnecessary. So we were able to reduce some of it. I know we may have actually not reduced pages, but we made things more listed, easier to follow, easier to do. So, and taking away some of this language. So we may have removed language and added some space, but made it more user friendly for that for the versus the 2016. Next, material section. Again, what is the item that we're discussing and what materials will it entail? All the material sections, section 1010, that's in the 1000s. And then we can go into that point on the other parts. So it kind of gives you a cross-reference of where to go to find the information. So an example of the layout for the construction. In 401, we use this example. No longer 40103, it's 401.3. Just took out the unnecessary zero. Made it a little easier for us to hyperlink and put things together. And a little more reader friendly. We did make a few changes. As you can see, we kept the same amount of letters in the table, but in the right side with 2020, we actually described the pre-paving proportion of it, and then made a few changes throughout. Material production in the 16, we removed that part as that is a 1000 section particular, and then the surface tolerance versus wearing surface. Just wording. I'll make sure that we get everything corrected in that sense. Next, method of measurement. Again, some of these are brief, pretty precise, and it's just about the method of measurement. Not about payment, not about construction, just how we're going to measure it. And then the last section would be the basis of payment. Again, this is the 401. So this kind of gives you an example of the department will pay for, and that is something that it will means an action of the department. So the department will pay for, the department will test, where shall is a action statement for the contractor. The contractor application, they shall perform the work. But the way this is kind of formatted in the specifications is that now they're written to the contractor. So if it's the department doing something, we spell out the department. If it's an action that the contractor is doing, it's assumed that this is written to the contractor. So we do present that matter. Again, 401 section, the safety edge is still present and part of the paving operation. And there is a detail for that. We did work on that particular part of the detail. So to get into the general voice and mode, the active voice versus passive voice, and trying to move that along to where we want to be. So in the past, we were a little more descriptive in what we're trying to achieve. And the active voice allows us to present what the engineer will be doing. So the engineer will take a sample as an example. If you go into the 100 sections, right in the general, very first paragraph, it kind of describes a little bit of this active voice and what our mode, imperative mode, and what we're trying to achieve as the goal for the specs and details. Specs themselves. So passively, we would just say a sample, a sample will be taken, but it didn't really give you direction. It didn't give you who was taking that sample. Where now we're saying actively, where the engineer will take the sample. If not, it's assumed the contractor is doing the work. And imperative mode is more of an instruction, a guidance to whom we're saying this to. So examples, pour the concrete versus the concrete will be poured. So we're trying to be a little more concise. Troner, as the consultant, definitely helped us on this matter. They presented gave us a lot of good advice and helped us present what we have now. So language, to be more concise, 2016 was sometimes a little more added words unnecessarily. Construct Portland cement concrete curb. we've defined what Portland cement concrete curb is. It's PCC. No reason to restate the statement again and again, because in that statement alone in the 16, I think it's stated at least 3 times, and it's or as directed by the engineer. Well, that's part of the construction part. That's not a description. That's not an item description. An item description work consists of constructing PCC curbing. That's 701. We're doing curb. In the manual, in the 16, it was more paragraph form reading. Want to make this a little easier for the reader. So rather than being in a paragraph broken apart where you have to find it, try to list it out. Makes it a little more user-friendly, maybe a little more searchable. Again, in a digital platform, you can do searches. You're able to find keywords. Sealing is sealing part of it, is backfilling part of it. These are all actions that are part of the basis of payment for this particular item, which is being your sidewalk itself. So what is part of it? What is not? What does the department pay for? What does the department pay for separately? And it kind of breaks those descriptions up. And we'll get into an example of that. The use of references. So when we created this and we moved forward with it, rather than repeating, for example, 501.3, construction for concrete, rather than repeating that particular section within the sidewalk section, within the curb section, we cross-reference that particular part for the curing, for curing compounds, for how to correct for weather statements, things of that form. It eliminates having to find repetition for future improvement. So if we move forward and we do a supplemental and we find that there's a better method to an operation, because this is all about growth. One of the additives that we were able to do is introduce what is current construction, what is current practices, how are we moving forward. So rather than going in trying to fix multiple sections throughout the manual, we can go into 501, resolve the, add the new method or delete the old method, and then not have to repeat ourselves in 701, 705. Again, 202 is cross-referenced in here, prepping the foundation according to 701. So I believe this was an excerpt from 705, just as an example. So in general, the 100 section, is, again, there's the listing of where we have. Not a lot of changes here, just a lot of updates that were done without. A couple main sections that we did make some changes to include the claim section, scheduling, section 108, and we'll kind of get into a couple of those. So, and 101 definitions, unit of measures. We did clean up the definitions. We did add, like I said, PCC is a description or is an abbreviation, so it's not in the definition. But we did add that in there and not have to repeat ourselves. We did add clarifications and reduce definitions accordingly. Units of measure also includes decimal points to how we're measuring within the sections, so that we're not repeating ourselves of how to take a measurement, how to take a linear foot, how to do a square yard, how to do, what's the expectations for that applies to the contractor, to the inspector, to performing the work in the doing the IDRs. Added electronic bidding in the 102. Of course, we're definitely into that. We got forced into it a little faster than we were getting into it, but I think it's working very well. And in 103, escrow requirements, did some updates there. and 104 scope of work. We did make some changes into the layout of 104. For example, 104.3 was a reference in bus stops in 2016. Now it's notification of contract changes. Bus stops were moved into a different portion of the spec and work kind of for placement wise. So we're not repeating ourselves arbitrarily. And maintaining traffic. Again, this is one thing that when it comes to a pre-construction meeting, you can have 4 options to enter your traffic control. Either you accept what we provided, you provide what's necessary for the plan. Again, it's all kind of spelled out and gives some references for both to how to design it and what the expectations are for the contractor coming in. 104.13, contractor roles and responsibilities. I know that was 104.15. It's not, we did not make significant changes to that particular section as much as the fashion that we did cross-reference that section in the 2016 quite a bit. So contractor sole for the work, B, rebuild, repair, restore, make all good all losses, injuries. So rather than making the statement that remove and replace, crack curb, remove and replace, those statements were removed because it's in 104.13. So the expectation is that it's the sole and absolute responsibility for the work until we accept it. And then there are provisions for open up to traffic prior to completion, for phasing. All that's been worked in there in that sense. Just a continuation of that particular part of how to, in case the work is suspended, roles, responsibilities, it's listed out rather than paragraph format. If it's going to be suspended, we want, vegetation, keep damage, and there needs to be a definite responsibility role there. 105 is the department's responsibilities. Where we stand, this is where the claim sections would be. We've added some language into the waivers of up to $50,000 to allow for some movement of these particular actions, and also the final decision is the secretary's decision, so we removed arbitration. I know this has been shared amongst the groups. I'm just pointing it out. We did break up the 105.16, partial acceptance, project acceptance, final acceptance, project closeout, so that it's a little more clear. We added days of expectations rather than, I believe it was an immediate or actions in that sense. I know that right now we're still working under initial and primary. I know that language is not part of this particular part and is trying to introduce a section in due course. So that's a different, same section, just a language difference there. So 106, 107, just general editing, listing, clarifications. There was a lot of cross-referencing. The lab significantly helped in that sense to make that work. 108, subcontracting. It's also the scheduling. We added, according to the plans bid proposal, you'd have a type 1 CPM, a type 2 CPM, or a bar chart. Make a simplex and a complex CPMs for short duration projects, long duration projects. Make it more accommodating to the needs of the activity of the plan. So we felt there was a need as a department, so we did add that in, and also as a contractor. 109, measurement and payment. Again, general edits, clarify responsibilities of who's measuring what's measured and what's being measured. So getting into the 200s, those are the sections 201 to 211. 201, we added some language in there for the clear spaces. specifically around shared use paths and sidewalks for the vegetation portion of it. And we did add in the details, M3 was also tries to interject what the expectation is: 2 foot on each side, 10 foot in the air, you know, where it's being placed, and whose responsibility. So that if we're doing a path, we know that we need to clear that out. So it's just something that you have to keep in mind when we're scoping the projects. If there's vegetation around there, there may need to be 201 for clearing. There was some also revisions in the language for level and filling voids versus some of the previous ones. 202, this was pretty much a format change. The language was there. There was a lot of work here that was done. I appreciate the effort to construction to help format this in the matter of how it's being used. So going from general into obstructions, and then the fourth top being topsoil, you know, it just didn't flow. So there was some reorganization, rewording, trying to clarify what's needed, where we're doing the activity, and how. So again, that one was a definite reorganization. Specific borrow type for undercut, we do reference a type C, and there are some accommodations that need to be made in that sense. If you're outside of, if you can use existing, again, those are all according to the plans. And we also added into the method measure electronic survey services, trying to keep up with technology and move things in the forward momentum. 203, minor changes. 04, 207, backfilling. So the act of backfilling. This is so that if we're placing a pipe, we pay for the pipe in 601. Then we need to excavate out, we would excavate, and the 207 would account for the excavation, account for the compaction, the backfilling action of, and if we need material, then it would be under 209 on the borrow material. Again, 209 borrow, we did provide some clarification of what borrow providing only is, borrow type B, C, and F, and to the method of measure, or into the item description. So a couple item description there, same item, just a clarification of the description. 301, not a lot of changes in 301 or 302, minor clarifications, some listings, some general gist. 401, 402, 403, so bituminous in the 400 section. I will go through an example here in a minute, just to kind of show a side-by-side comparison, just as an example, of course. Under 401, we made a few changes. Instead of 3 days, it's 30 calendar days for the job mix formula. That's not plant mix, that's specifically job mix formulas. Joint location, just some clarifications on where it's at, and some descriptions of such as the rollers do, not to mar the surface. So we have the final product that meets the 10-foot straight edge or as it's presented, whatever the contract has it in its sense. 402 for patching, again, versus trying to restate what joint sealing is, we get into the section that it's referenced in 504, and it's also part of the basis of payment is that it's paid under 504. So just to do a comparison of the 401 versus 2020 on the left, 2016, the description is less. We added the before paving operations, 30 days in there, listed things out for formatting to make it a little clearer, a little easier to read. What's the expectations of the hauling equipment, what's the expectation of the bed, going to next pages, going into, referencing the detail for the safety edge. So we're not telling you what the percentage is here. We're telling you to go to the detail, find out. So if we need to make a slope percentage change, we can go to the detail. We don't need to restate it here in the specs and then state it in the detail. We can make one change and be done. Tack coat, there was some definite additions that were added into the tack coating portion of it. Just an example of, again, what we added, what we changed. Moving this forward and to the right side of the screen are kind of screenshots of what was done in the 16 and what was replaced. Just taking upon ourselves to kind of interject the replace the paragraph, the second paragraph in section I3. And moving forward, we want to make the revisions, but they want to add them in to so one platform. It'll just be an updated manual per se, revised manual, so that everything will be there. They won't have to cross-reference. Right now, we're opening up two different documents. You open up the specs, the 16s, and you open up revisions and see where the changes are. Try to make this easier. So you have one screen in the field, and you only need to do it one time. Again, tack coat, trying to implement some changes there, make it a little more accommodating to the needs of new asphalt. If it's a milled surface, if it's concrete, the expectations, the range, where the dilution is, a lot of changes in that side, but more of application of the materials itself. Consolidate the placement of it. So rather than trying to spell that out, make some differences in that sense. Into just some changes in the, instead of wearing surface, instead of tolerance, we want to make sure it meets the 10-foot straight edge, 1/4 inch guidance. And what the department will pay. So the department will pay for and accept. And then it B, like C and D, the department will make adjustments according to. And incentive, decentives, if it's presented in the project, how we're paying for BCBC. And just a general conversation here. Rather than referencing, we're in section 104, I think in the 16s, it actually states 104, page 4. We have a continuation of pages. So just a minor change, but it did allow us to make the hyperlinks work, to make the format of the manual in a digital platform a little easier to do. Again, minor change it does have some effect, but not of significance. Okay, so my last section for myself would be the 500. I'm hitting the button. Sorry about that. I had a minor setback. Looking at the 500 section, rigid pavement. Again, a lot of the curb reference, the 700 sections will reference the 500. And that will, so it is important to have that perspective. We did make some general changes in there. We reduced the language for slip form and fixed form rather than repeating ourselves. We would reference back to 501.31, so the general construction of it. Prior to in 16, we actually repeated ourselves into that manner. Eliminated a couple pages. It also eliminated having to restate the same things and restate it correctly and make sure that we correct and we didn't miss something in a revision or miss something in a slip form versus fixed form. There are some differences between those two, and they are broken out accordingly. But there are some similarities as well. Added joint seal, and that particular part, it's a uniform detail, whether it's patching or whether it's roadway, and we'll get into that this afternoon for that particular detail to help describe and do what the expectations are, how we're truly building it, and how we're constructing it. Maintain the temperatures, you know, and placement of 3 days. Again, these are all expectations. And there were some differences between the 700 curb sidewalk expectations and 501 expectations. Again, they're cross-referenced back, and we don't have, if you're doing concrete, you're doing concrete. Whether it's roadway, whether it's sidewalk, whether it's curb. Concrete is concrete. It has the same properties. It needs to cure out the same time frames, and we get the same, because we are looking for different strengths depending on the application and performance. So they do all go back to the same cross-reference. So just something to really pay attention to. And again, reading the specs, reading the cross-references, getting familiar with the changes will definitely help move everything along in that sense. 503 patching, again, some general changes, some what is the expectation finish, provide a time finish on concrete patch. So that we have it, it's a roadway. We want the time finish. We need the time finish for retraction. Install according to the standard construction details and joints. So rather than trying to describe how to place joints, we have a detail for it, so we reference the detail. No reason to repeat ourselves and have that unnecessary added language in there, and make everything a little bit more clear, concise, easier for the reader, better for the application of it, and also just to make it a little more digital friendly as well. You know, not to repeat ourselves. We don't want to repeat the same language. And you know, if it's a standard language, we don't need to say it on the plans. In the same token, we don't need to say what's in the detail on the spec and vice versa. I'll be handing the next section over to Barry Benton with GPI. He'll then be going to Adam for a brief, and then I believe a break. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oz. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Barry Benton. I worked for DelDOT for 25 years, and I retired in 2017. And I'm going to carry it on from 600 on through 705, and then we'll give you a short break. I know for some of you who do know me, you may think that would be unbearable today with my Pittsburgh Steelers. I'm 6-0. Some of the local teams that I don't share affinity for, maybe not doing as well, but I've matured a lot since I left the department, and I rest assured that I've kept that out of my presentation. Actually, Oz wouldn't let me have any slides. So with that, we're going to start off with section 6, O and O. Sorry, section 600. I got confused. That's the Steelers record. They're undefeated. 6, O, and O. Sorry about that. That last number is for the ties for all you Eagles fans out there. Okay, we're going to move forward here. So starting with section 601, under pipe culverts. And again, as I said, this presentation is not, we're not going to read through the specs word for word. We're just going to try to highlight some of the big things that you're going to see between the 2016 and the 2020. And I want to note that section 600 underwent a big rewrite in 2016. So this is more fine tuning it. It was such a big rewrite then that there was things that was either missed or needed to be condensed. It was still redundant, and they did a really nice job this time of paring it down. So with regard to pipe culverts, the first thing to talk about is the crack width. It changed from 0.1 inches to 0.01 inches. That's noted as a defect. We removed metal pipes from the section. It's just not something that gets used a lot by the department anymore, just due to some of the history that we've had here. We changed the name of the high density polyethylene pipe to thermoplastic pipe. And that's just because there's more than just HDPE. There's other types of high density or a thermoplastic pipe that are used, including polypropylene. And under the thermoplastic pipe section, we also added 1 inch for the joint separation. That's more in line with the tolerance for those types of joints. And I could feel my Apple Watch going off. I think it must be Mark Lutz hitting me up with some text about these Eagles. And we changed the backfill from 601.3. The first lift used to be allowed to be 12 inches. Now they're 8 inches. Under drainage structures, we changed the loading requirement from HS20 to HS25. And the HS25, the axle loads for that are the same as HO90. Under 604 temporary works, this was a new section from the 2016 specs. 604 used to be rebar. 2016 was changed to temporary works. And a lot of those things were taken out of what is now 610, the concrete section and put into here. So for this, we collected all the language concerning construction and removal of formwork and all that. And we took just compiled it and reorganized to better so it reads better. Of note that was added in here, we added the section on form liners. It was a special provision, and it's now a new item, 604005. And we also reorganized 604.3.8, and now it also includes temporary timber matting. So the former item for that was 621.500. Now it's a standard item, 604.004. With driven piles, this was a pretty large rewrite from the 2016. It was completely reorganized. The way that it was in 2016, we had submittals kind of put throughout the specification. So all of the submittals, especially like the wave equation, they were brought up and put right at the front of 605.3. We removed some of the things that aren't used. Jetting and augering are uncommon activities and don't need to be in standard specs, so they were moved. And the pile driving procedures were reorganized in the sections for test piles, production piles, and pile restrikes in the order that they would have them. And it follows the same format for each one of those. With each one of those has a subsection of preparation, driving, and post-driving. Drilled shafts. This one was done, I believe, by Mike Gettings. And there was a significant edit in this for organization. There were some things added with regard to rock sockets, and there's some new items with regard to that with bearing nose and rock. Also, the testing requirement was updated in 606.3.11. We added a subsection about exploratory drilling. And item 606.031 existed, but there was no guidance, so it's used in conjunction with the rock socket section. Section 607, earth retaining wall systems. This was changed the title. This was formerly known as mechanically stabilized earth wall, more general now. And one of the big things that was added here was the first perpendicular to the back face of the panel for the full height of the wall. And this was something that we used to have problems with MSC walls. You would see a pile of fill in front of them, even with the fabric behind the walls. And the thought here is that with the 3 foot behind the wall, instead of using stone for the entire backfill, but to use it there behind the wall to prevent losing that fill. 608, permanent sheet piles. There were only minor changes in that section. So 610, concrete structures. This one, it really didn't change a whole lot in content, but it was, again, significantly reorganized. It was revised to give a uniform structure, makes referencing a particular point a lot easier. But some of the things of note that did change between 2016 and 2020 is that now mass concrete pours need to be noted on the plans. And this applies to both cast in place and precast concrete. Designers should discuss with materials and research during design to decide which elements are designated mass concrete. So it's something just to note to the designers if you've got mass concrete pours. Also, slip forming a bridge barrier. is still not allowed unless the contract includes a special provision allowing it. In cases where it is not allowed, but the contractor requests a change and it is allowed, then follow the same provision performance spec. And UHPC did not quite make the cut in 2020. It remains a special provision item for now, but that is ultra high performance concrete for those of you who don't know. But we do expect it to become a standard in the future. It's getting used more and more with the department, especially with accelerated bridge construction coming to the front. So we do look for that to maybe make the cut in the next edition. Some other changes to 610.3 had to do with pouring concrete underwater or tremie pours. And there are just a number of things about the tube and the diameter of the tremie tube. 611, which is concrete reinforcement, which prior to 2016 used to be 603 and 604. But there were just minor changes from the 2016, right? And with 612, which is precast concrete, only minor changes. Section 613, concrete coatings and membranes. We removed several specific requirements like the type of brush that was specified may conflict with the manufacturer's instructions. Again, this goes back to what Oz was saying in the beginning is we tried to be less specific on these things and let the manufacturer requirements speak for their products. Because otherwise we may be speccing something that is very strict and maybe against what the manufacturer recommends. Also,
Talk to the audience.
Okay. I didn't, all right. Also, the section on aesthetic staining intended, with today's, with the way that today's environment works, more and more we're producing bridges that look pretty. So there's a section on aesthetic staining intended for use with form liners to create stone or brick patterns. So. And then section 615, 616, 617, 619, and 621. These are steel structures, steel coating, steel sign structures, stone and brick masonry and wood structures, all just minor changes with regard to that. Section 623 on bearing devices, there were some significant changes with regard to this. In the past, bearing devices were only paid for on rehab projects, not on new construction. New construction bearings were included with the steel and with the superstructure items. Now they're paid separately, whereas before there was really no reason for the distinction. So now the intention is to pay for all bearing devices as separate items. Also, we moved language about designing bearings. It's always been in there about using method B of AASHTO, but it was moved up in the specification to a different location. So and we added a pay item for steel reinforced elastomeric bearings. Before, steel reinforced elastomeric bearings were paid under elastomeric bearings. There was no difference, but they are different bearings. So we added a pay item to separate those out. Section 624, joints. The main thing with this is that we changed the steel coating to galvanizing instead of painting, which from a maintenance standpoint just makes sense. I think was long overdue. And this section was assembled from a number of special provision items. There was a lot of repetitiveness between the subsections, so it was significantly condensed between the 2016 and the 2020 specs. And then wrapping up the section 600, microsilica modified concrete overlays were removed. They're just not used much here. We use typically latex modified overlays, and also we use a lot of PPC or polyester polymer concrete. So that was added, and also the PCC for your thicker overlays, that was added as well. Section 626 metal railings and section 628 concrete repair and rehabilitation only show minor changes. Okay, section 700, we're going to go through all of these, but before, we're going to give you a quick break after we go through the first couple. So we're going to go all the way through 705. And this does look like 7-0-0, which is what the Steelers will be next week after defeating the Ratbirds from Baltimore. It's nice doing it via web because nobody can say anything back. I'm sure if you get any questions about that, we'll see. Section 701, PCC curb, integral curb, PCC curb, PCC monolithic median, and curb openings. So we listed a number of things here that were either moved or changed. Of note, I'm going to highlight a couple of things here. First of all, in 701.3, the expansion joints were changed from 160 feet to 150 feet. So at a maximum 150-foot intervals, and also aligned with adjacent joints. So if there's joints in sidewalk, you know, your curbs are going to want to line up with that. And we added in it says construct contraction joints in accordance with standard construction details at a maximum of 10 foot, which was always there, but a minimum of 4-foot intervals was added. And for cracked or damaged curbs, we now instruct them to remove and replace within the joint section. So you will go from a contraction joint to a contraction joint. And the basis of pavement, excavation embankment outside of the template. So any of the excavation embankment inside of the template will be the same, but if it's outside, it's highlighted that it's at the direction of the engineer. So will only be paid if the engineer direction. It's not within the template. Under 705, PCC sidewalk, pedestrian connections, and detectable warning surface. For this one, we reduced the interval of the joint from 10 feet. So that's of significant note from the 2016. Also under 705.3, we allow them to, with the detectable warning surface, is once again, we're going to defer to the manufacturer's recommendations, place the mortar under that in accordance with that. So the new specification just in general does not give direction to a manufacturer's item. And we added the 705.5 basis of payment that this includes all curb and curb taper length. This is for the pedestrian connections. So the pedestrian connections include curb and curb taper lengths required for connection compliance. For 706 under monument, there were just minor changes. And then under section 707, the preset concrete riprap, once again, we're going to defer to the manufacturer's recommendations for weather limitations. So with that, got a couple more here. 708 and 709, just minor changes, geotextile and under drains. 710 and 711, and this is the water services and utility services. The section's been reduced to convey guidance to the utility owner specifications. So once again, we're going to defer to the utility owner. We take a little bit of the not getting as specific in our spec. We're going to defer to them. If they do not provide a specification, then the construction will follow the DelDOT standard details and DelDOT utility manual. But the key here is that the order of precedence starts with the utility owner specifications. It overrules ours. And here's some of the things that were added with adjusting water service within the pavement. So it includes all of these items here that are outlined in 1 through 7 and 1. Section 711 sanitary sewer system follows section 710 very closely. And again, the section's been reduced significantly to convey guidance to utility owner specifications. So perform the work in accordance with the contract and utility owner specification. In case of conflict between the contract and utility owner specification, the utility owner specification takes precedence. Very similar to 710. And then again, these are the items, once again, in 711.3 construction. You can see a lot of parallel here between 710 and 711. Okay, with that, we're going to go to take our first break. Oh, I skipped by it. There we go. And it is now, I've got 9:57. Let's come back at 10:05, and we're going to pick up with a presentation on MASH bridge barriers. And then we're going to go into the rest of the standard specifications and finish up. Bathrooms are down the hall at your house, I guess. And snacks are in the fridge or maybe in the pantry. So we'll be back with you. Let's rejoin at 10:05. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. My name is Mike Millman. I want to say thank you for joining us today. Welcome back. I know a lot of you guys already, so I'm going to skip the personal introduction and hop right into the material. There's a lot of material here today. Just kind of wandering on a lot of material here today that we're going to go over. And my job really is to break up the day from spec training and trying to work on some crash videos and keep everybody engaged. So got to get right to that job. All right, got a little delay there. So the objectives of this training, what we really want to do today is talk to you about what MASH compliance actually means. I'm going to present some new details in the DelDOT bridge manual, as well as Adam's going to present some new details in the standard construction details today. We want to give you a little background on why those details are changing and discuss what MASH compliance actually means. We're going to discuss the role of the FHWA, ASHTO, the user agency, i.e. DelDOT, in implementing MASH compliance and what that means. We're going to talk about the standard bridge rails, their appropriate application. Again, some of the details have changed in the updated bridge design manual. We're going to kind of go over where the applications have changed and been updated. And finally, we're going to discuss the standard, a new standard stiffness transition that DelDOT has adopted. The stiffness transition is going to be talked about in Adam's presentation as well, but it's a very important concept. It's going to be a little bit different than what DelDOT's used to. So we're both going to kind of tag team that one today. So whenever I do a training, I always like to start with why is this important to my job? Why is this an important topic? I think everybody in this virtual room can agree that creating a safe roadside environment is something that's very important to all of us. We want to create, getting a thumbs up from Mike, create a safe public transportation facilities out there. It's so much so that it's canon number 1 of the Delaware Association of Professional Engineers Engineering Code of Ethics. And this topic is directly tied to that. So the statistics that I pulled is that in 2016, the year that MASH 2016 was implemented, there were 1,088 fatalities where the most harmful event was either a barrier or barrier end. Now, this only accounts for 5.6% of the roadway departure fatalities. However, we as engineers are the ones prescribing the use of those barriers and those barrier ends on our roadways. And I think we can all agree that we can do a little bit better than those 1,088 fatalities. As an industry, we can do better. And we always want to be moving, in the borrow an FHWA term, we want to be moving towards zero deaths. I think that's something that we can all agree on. We always want to try to improve. So case in point, this is the classic example of what not to do. This is the breakaway cable terminal. It was created in the 1970s. It was used widely throughout the country. And you can see there was a little nasty habit with this. The cable or the end terminal would come through the car, steer into the car, and end up in the compartment. And that's not what we want to do. You know, creating a safer roadside environment is something we always want to strive to do. So we want to be learning and reacting as we go. So now, what is the MASH manual? Someone earlier discussed what the MASH manual is. So what the MASH manual is, it stands for the Manual for Assessing Safety Hardware. Probably the best acronym in our industry full of acronyms. Very straightforward and to the point. What is the purpose of MASH? So MASH clearly states their purpose. And I'm going to read to you this because it's very important. Purpose of this manual is to present uniform guidelines for the crash testing of both permanent and temporary highway safety features and recommended evaluation criteria to assess test results. So that's what it is. There's nothing more, nothing less. Some people have thought that maybe it's design guidance. It's not design guidance. It's not a listing of crash-worthy barriers, and it is not an agency's policy. These are all separate things. And something like MASH has existed since 1962 with the Highway Research Correlation Services Circular 482, which was a one-page paper. Anyone that's seen MASH knows it progressed quite a bit since that one-page paper. Getting a laugh from Adam. So why is MASH compliance important? So the simple answer is the answer that is to this question and a lot of our these questions in our industry is that to not jeopardize federal funding, we want to be MASH compliant. So the FHWA and AASHTO signed a joint implementation agreement in 2016, shortly after the MASH manual was published. And that joint implementation agreement set sunset dates for the previous crash testing criteria of NCHRP report 350 compliant devices, as well as sun. The term is MASH compliance. So the FHWA has been very clear that MASH compliance is determined by the user agency. These excerpts that I have below all come from one memo that's dated April 9th, 2018 from the FHWA to the division direct administrators, as well as other federal lands division engineers and directors of field services. Just going to note a couple of these for you. The roadside safety hardware is eligible for federal funding, but has been determined to be crash-worthy by the user agency, i.e. state DOT. It is each state's responsibility to determine crash-worthiness. And the determination of crash-worthiness of roadside safety hardware acceptance for use on highway projects and installation and maintenance of responsibilities handled at the state and local level. So based on this memo and the FHWA's practices, it's pointing back to DelDOT to determine their own MASH compliance. And we have this with give a shout out to the MASH committee that DelDOT has. So what does MASH compliance actually mean? So we talked about what the MASH manual is, but what does MASH compliance actually mean? So MASH breaks down the safety evaluation criteria in 4 categories. Today we're here to talk about bridge rails, so we're going to focus on longitudinal barriers, but Adam's going to hit on some of the other applications later on today. MASH also breaks down the test levels, or MASH breaks out the test into 6 different categories based on the impact speed. So kind of designing for what you think is going to be a realistic crash. And then finally, MASH also does the evaluation criteria, and they've broken those down into 3 factors as well. So we're going to talk about the test level selection. So what I want to note here is that the test levels 1 through 3 are solely based on the small car and the pickup truck. The only thing that changes with those applications is the speed at which the vehicle is impacted. Not until we get to the TL4, 5, and 6 do we add in the large truck testing. And what that essentially does in the TL4, 5, and 6 is it's taking the TL3 test level and adding that large truck test on top of it. So everyone out there has kind of done drainage design before. It's kind of a recurrence interval, what you're kind of actually expecting to design for. For example, it doesn't make sense to design a bridge rail or a crash with a 80,000-pound tractor trailer van on low volume, low trucks, local roadway. So this is the matrix that goes with the crash testing for longitudinal bridge rail. And again, the key point I want to show here is that the only thing that's changing between the TL1s, 2s, and 3s is the impact speed. And the reason why that they're in weird numbers is that was originally based on kilometers per hour. The other thing I really want to note here is that the 410, 411, 510, 511, 610, 611 test is essentially equivalent to a 310 and 311 test. The only thing we've done is we've added on top of it the 412, 512, and 612 tests for large cars. So now what I'm going to do is walk you through an example of what MASH compliance actually means and go through the testing and evaluation process. So highlighted this, we're going to look at the TL5 test level. This is for longitudinal barrier. This is what's in the MASH manual. So I want to note is that MASH is going to look at the prescribe the test number. So the 510, 511, and 512, the test vehicles that are being using for those crash tests. And then also the speed and the angle that those that the vehicles will be impacting at. And it also tells you the evaluation criteria here in this last column on the right. So to quickly walk through that, I said there was 3 criteria before for structural adequacy, which is shown on this slide. Next slide shows occupant risk. And the next one is post-vehicular impact response. So those are the 3 criteria. The matrix also tells you which evaluation criteria it needs to pass for each test. So the 510 and 511 tests require that A, D, F, H, and I meet MASH's criteria. The 512 test requires A, D, and G meet MASH crash testing criteria. So you can perform your crash, and then you can walk over to the structural adequacy test, and you can ask yourself, did this meet the requirements of MASH? So the test article contain and redirect the vehicle, bring the vehicle to controlled stop. And if you fail any of those criteria, you fail the test. So what is different under MASH? I'm sure you've heard a lot of people say that the industry is changing. Nothing we used before is good anymore. You've heard other people say, not a big deal. So what is different under MASH? So MASH updated the test vehicles to reflect the 85th percentile of the U.S. passenger vehicle fleet. That makes sense. Vehicles have gotten bigger. Makes sense to test what's actually on the road. They've updated inconsistencies in previous test matrices. So you can see over here on the right side, I have the test matrix that the crash tests are performed at, and you can see the impact angles are very consistent. The speeds are very consistent. In the previous NCHRP report 350 criteria, these varied a little bit, and they've reduced that variability and made it much more straightforward, and also in correlation with the real world crash conditions. And finally, this is the big one, so big that I'm going to have a couple slides on this. They made the criteria, the evaluation criteria, which I showed you before, inherently less subjective. So what does that mean? I'm going to read this to you because it's really important. So bear with me. NCHRP report 350 over on the left side of the screen. These criteria require the test article not penetrate the occupant compartment. There be no deformations of or intrusions into the occupant compartment that could cause a disabling injury. So the key word here is a disabling injury. Disabling injury to me is probably different than what Adam Weiser or Barry Benton would define as disabling injury. Disabling injury to Barry is probably when the Ravens beat the Steelers on Sunday. Sorry, I had to do it. So MASH, instead, they break this into real quantifiable evaluation criteria. So you can't have deformation of intrusion that's more than 4 inches in the roof, and the wheel well area can be more than 9 inches, and so forth and so on through the criteria. So this is such a big important example that I'm going to give you another 2 slides. This is a case in point example. Trust me, the application on the left, which is a metric, is the same as the application on the right. The application on the left is tested with NCHRP report 350 criteria. The application on the right is tested to MASH. This is the crash test for the MASH. So the truck's redirected, doesn't roll over, seems to contain it pretty well. This is passing test. And the answer is no. Under MASH, this is not a passing test. And the reason why is the wheel well deformation shown on the right side of the screen exceeds that 9-inch criteria. So go back to the NCHRP report 350 criteria, and this is a passing test. Well, I don't know. At worst, probably a broken ankle, broken leg. Is that disabling? My definition might be it's not. Barry's might be it is. You don't know. So that's a subjectivity that's added into MASH. Or reduced, or added into 350, sorry. So now we're going to talk about some of the changes that made to the DelDOT bridge rails based on updating the MASH. So we wanted to do, our process through this was to kind of look at the DelDOT bridge rails, confirm it's MASH compliant or not, and then once we confirm it's MASH compliant, say, does this make sense for the department and the needs that we're actually facing? So some of these changes are based more on better meeting the needs of the department and also public users that are using our bridges. So a couple changes, replace the 42-inch F-shape with a 42-inch single slope barrier, a TL5. We replaced the old 42-inch median barrier with the glare screen, 50-inch, with a new single slope median barrier, 50-inch as well. And we also replaced the old F-shape 54-inch gap protection barrier with a new 54-inch single slope barrier. And hopefully by now you've kind of noticed a trend here. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Changes to the DelDOT bridge rail, we also removed the old pedestrian rail barrier, which was a TL2 application, and replaced it with a new pedestrian rail barrier, which is a 2-strand tube rail, which can also function as a TL4 application when it's placed as a traffic barrier, and it can function as a TL2 application when it's placed behind a raised curb and sidewalk. So I alluded to this earlier. Hopefully you caught the differences, replacing the F-shapes with some of the single slopes and high-speed applications. So single slopes have become very popular in recent years. From the contracting community, which you don't have on this slide, the contractors really like them based on the simple geometry of the shape. And the DOTs really like the barriers for two primary reasons. One is the system is not affected by future pavement overlay. Anyone that's worked with the F shape or New Jersey shape, the safety shapes, and that you get that 3-inch toe down there to put an overlay down. But after that, you're affecting the geometry of the face of the barrier, which is not good. So the single slope barrier, you can conceivably overlay in front of that barrier all the way up to its minimum effective height and not affect the geometry of the face of the barrier. So that's a good reason. But the more important reason for our application here in Delaware is safety. So I'm not going to make my own words. I'm going to have just use the FHWA's words here. And this comes from a Q&A. This bullet comes from a Q&A. There was a memo from the FHWA. And the question was, which concrete barrier shape should we use? Jersey shape, F shape, constant slope, single slope, or vertical? Basically, the answer from the FHWA is that on high-speed applications, single slope barriers are most appropriate to limit rollovers. It's citing changes in vehicle fleets based on airbags and other developments. And that's saying the F shape is still probably more appropriate for lower speeds. So give you a little example of rollovers. Danny, play the video. Give you a little example of rollovers.
The shaped profile of this bridge rail causes a vehicle to ride up the barrier as it is redirected. This vertical motion dissipates energy, resulting in less vehicle damage and better occupant response than the comparable impact with the vertical wall. This test showed that the occupant responses were within the allowable range. Since shaped barriers dissipate some energy by lifting the vehicle off the ground, there's a chance that vehicles may sometimes roll over, as happened in this test of the GM shape. This type of accident is almost always very severe. The small car crash test is...
All right, so that video explained what rollovers are. And so rollovers are very severe. So the single slope, and this is a small car test for a Caltrain single slope barrier. Just notice how clean this car comes off this wall. So you get a little bit of uplift, but not nearly the instability that you saw with the safety shape. So on higher speed facilities, where cars are probably going faster than the speed at which the crash test is performed at 62 miles per hour, it kind of makes sense to try to limit the rollover potential. And just because it's cool, this is a TL5 test of a tractor trailer hitting a single slope barrier. Gotta love that. So this is the guidance that's now on the bridge rail or the bridge design manual for single slope barriers. And you can see the key word in this first sentence is it's for use on expressways and freeways that are considered TL5 applications. So we're kind of meeting the goals of the FHWA as well as industry best practice and using this on very high speed facilities where rollovers are concerned. The guidance on where to use the glare screen as well as the gap protection barrier haven't changed. Another new bridge rail that we've added into DelDOT's toolbox, which I think is going to be a great tool for the department, is a crash tested application which comes from Caltrans. Has a federal eligibility letter as a TL2 compliant bridge rail. And the key thing with this is the curb in front of the parapet. Anyone that's worked with guardrail knows that the curb is a key contributor to the effectiveness of the guardrail. The curb affects the vehicle chassis as it hits the curb. And with guardrail, it can have you either override or underride the system. And with parapet, we're talking about the instability or rollovers that come from the effect of that chassis moving. So this is a crash tested application. The vertical wall can be replaced, and we'll get into that later. This is the crash test for it. This is the TL3 311 test, actually. They tried to test it for TL3 compliance and didn't meet them in compliance. But just watch the truck hits the wall, and then watch how much it lifts up as it hits the wall. And we're going to talk about that a little bit when we get into the vertical wall barriers later. So there's quite a bit of uplift, but it's a passing test. The 310 test for the car, the small car, actually failed. So another new bridge rail, forever known as the Mike Gettings rail. We were in a meeting with Mike and the rest of the bridge group, and we could see Mike falling in love with this bridge rail as we were presenting it. And there is a lot to love about this rail. So it's TL4 compliant. It's now going to be the new preferred rail. And to back up to the Caltrans rail, which we just saw, it can't be placed behind that raised curb and sidewall, but if you do that, it now becomes a TL2 rail. That curb is the key factor in that TL2 test level. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it, because anything higher speed, you don't really want to have pedestrians right on higher speed facility anywhere. So this is the application where we're going to use it, and it's the preferred bridge rail for bridges and sidewalks and shared use paths. Sorry for the jumping around the slides. Something's sensitive, so I apologize for that. Another new bridge rail, forever known as the Craig Stevens rail. Craig was a big proponent of that one, and we're still waiting for John Tice's submission, or an adequate John Tice submission to make a new John Tice rail. Sorry, John. For our consultants out there and our contractors that work in multiple states, you might recognize this from Maryland. You might think it's Maryland invented this rail. Well, Maryland's actually borrowing this rail from Oregon DOT. And again, there's a lot to like about this rail as well. You can see in the picture, it's a sleek looking rail. Maryland likes to use it in aesthetic locations. And the really big thing for us is that it's very, very, very useful for accelerated bridge construction. You can kind of see on the detail on the left that there's 2 anchor bolts that are set into the concrete. And then once those anchor bolts are set, the rail itself can go up really, really quickly. So this is the application guidance, and you can see that basically we're going to be applying these rails for aesthetic reasons on roadways, as well as and for accelerated bridge construction to really help speed up construction. 36-inch vertical wall. Really not much has changed. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Let me get you back to your spec training. Here's the crash test for it. And just look how little uplift is on the car when it crashes to that vertical wall. Compare that back to the safety shape, the single slope, and also the curve in front of that vertical wall. Same thing with the 42-inch vertical wall. Nothing's really changed with this application. So we're going to go by that one. We got a little video of a truck hitting the vertical wall.
Significantly reduced. In the single unit truck test, the vehicle only rolled 18 degrees, much less than either the New Jersey or F-shaped barrier tests. The vehicle was more stable in this test than in previous heavy vehicle tests.
So the bread and butter of what the department's been using, probably still going to be the bread and butter, because most of our applications are going to fall into the category for the application. Basically, DelDOT's going to continue to use it as the barrier of choice in arterial and collector roadways, where TL4 is the application we're going to use. A little key fact for the F-shape is it has not been crash tested to MASH. In fact, it wasn't even crash tested for NCHRP report 350 compliance. His compliance for 350 was actually grandfathered in by the FHWA in 1997. And just so you know that we're not assuming, and we're on our own assuming that the F-shape is MASH compliant. His compliance is based on the F-shape, or the Jersey shape, which is considered more critical in nature based on the rollover potential with that barrier. This is the crash test for the F-shape.
Although the New Jersey shape is the most common shaped concrete barrier, it is not the only one. A research project in the mid-70s identified a number of alternative shapes. Alternative F, now commonly called the F shape, was identified as a promising candidate. The slope breakpoint of the F shape is 3 inches lower than the New Jersey shape. This slightly different profile provides many of the same benefits as the New Jersey shape while improving vehicle stability during impact. Like the New Jersey shape, the F-shaped barrier dissipates energy by lifting the vehicle. The occupant responses in this small car test were somewhat larger than in the tests of the New Jersey shape, although they were still below allowable limits. The vehicle trajectory, however, was much better, minimizing the possibility of a second collision or a rollover. In the 18,000-pound truck test, the front of the vehicle rode up the face of the barrier and rolled 31 degrees until the cargo deck struck the top of the barrier. The F-shaped barrier performed better than the New Jersey shape in this truck test, since the vehicle did not roll as much and was redirected.
So that brings us to our final topic for this part of the presentation, and that's bridge rail ends or barrier ends. So to me, this is a very, very important consideration. As I mentioned before in the beginning of the presentation, is that this is something that we're putting on our roadside that we want to protect accordingly. It's a blunt object, we want to protect it. For those of you that think that maybe a bridge rail end, a blunt bridge rail end might be crash worthy, this video is for you. So as you can clearly see, it fails the windshield deflection criteria. Other than that, it looked good. So this one I made myself. I just had to do it. For a while there, we thought that putting a sloped end section on the side of high-speed roadways was a good idea. So this video is for you, and hopefully you get the sound. Music just timed up too well with that video, sorry. So the most common way to make them crash worthy is connect to a adjacent W-beam. So most of the times coming to a bridge or coming to a barrier, you're gonna have W-beam guardrail in front of it. Anyone that's worked with guardrail knows the way the guardrail works. It's a semi-rigid system compared to a rigid barrier system. That the guardrail, when you hit it, it deflects outward and slowly brings you back into the travelway. So you need to transition the stiffness between the two systems, or else you're going to kind of ride the rail into the rigid barrier system, which is this video. So again, not MASH compliant. So DelDOT adopted a new stiffness transition. And again, Adam's going to hit on this in more detail this afternoon as well, but this is a very important concept today. So the stacked W-beam guardrail that DelDOT has used quite frequently in the past fails MASH compliance. Part of MASH compliance requires us to be MASH compliant for transitions as well. And you can see the implementation date. So the application that we've gone with is actually a Thrive-Beam application. A lot of states have moved towards Thrive-Beam, and we've kind of followed suit. The application that we adopted is actually a 34-inch mounting height for the Thrive-Beam, and it's meant to be MASH crash worthy both before and after a 3. And also it has a lot added advantage for when you're connecting to a barrier, because the height of that connection is actually taller than the 31-inch, so you can take your vertical transition a lot shorter. The other thing that's really good about this too is that we've adopted this detail, PennDOT's adopted this detail, Maryland's adopted this detail, West Virginia has, and I believe Virginia has as well. So all the surrounding states are using this detail, which I think is a pretty powerful statement. So rather than talk about it, I'm just going to show you a picture. The top picture is the initial application. You can see the Thrive-Beam is mounted at 34 inches, runs out to a symmetric W Thrive-Beam, then it continues with 31-inch guardrail, which is labeled as the MGS. It's our 131 guardrail. The bottom picture is after a 3-inch overlay comes through. Obviously the Thrive-Beam doesn't move positions. You reduce the effective height of it from 34 inches to 31 inches. the thrive beam doesn't move, but you replace the symmetric W thrive beam with an asymmetric W thrive beam, and then the MGS can be raised up, which is 131 guardrail by 3 inches. And that's also been crash tested. And you have a crash-worthy application both before and after. This is the video of the crash test for the system. And this is, when you watch it, it's a much cleaner application than anything we saw before. It's very clean how that truck comes off there. So what went with that detail was the 34-inch detail is tested with the standard end post and is trying to show up before it's ready. A universal end buttress is what the researchers called it. Terms for it, called end block, end post, end buttress. But basically, that end buttress is designed to reduce snag and to work with various fry beams that are out there. So a couple of key elements with it is it's 6-to-1 height transition. So any vehicle that's leaning on the barrier reduces instability that way. The thrive beam connects to a vertical wall. So thrive beams have been tested in the past. I think there's been 2 that have been tested that have been mounted on a safety shape on an angle, and both of those failed. So, and also rather than using a wedge or anything else behind there to connect it vertically, the vertical wall. The transition to the safety shape, if you have a safety shape, has to occur 6 inches downstream of the thrive beam connector plate. A 10-to-1 lateral transition rate is used to make that transition from the vertical wall to your safety shape. And dual approach tapers are used, which I'm going to show you on this next slide. So this is out of the bridge design manual. This is an elevation view of the F-shape end post. So you can see on this front end, we have 2. We'll see that in the next slide too, which is that came up for me. There's a 1.5 foot chamfer on the bottom to reduce wheel snag. Along the whole length of the barrier, there's a 3x4 chamfer on the front as well. There's a 6-to-1 vertical height transition before you get to your ultimate height. You can see that at the top. There's a 10-to-1 lateral transition going from the vertical face to the safety shape that you're going to use. And you can see the distance between the beginning of the transition to where the thrive beam connects. And so those that remember the Craig Stevens rail and the 3-tube rail, we have also adopted a transition that's in the bridge design manual for that application as well. This is originally an Alaska DOT tested rail, or for a transition for tube rails, and we've adopted that and modified it for the DelDOT 3-strand tube rail. There's also the option to use the concrete end post for that. We adopted this to help with accelerated bridge construction, so slowing down to cast that end post. So hopefully today you learn what MASH compliance means and what it doesn't mean. It's no longer kind of a black box. So when someone says that, you understand it. Know what our role as DelDOT is to create be MASH compliant, understand the DelDOT center bridge rails, and understand the new stiffness transition. So with that, I will hand it off to the next presenter.
Good morning, everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm Adam Weiser. I'm with Whitman Reckhart Associates, and I want to thank Oz for allowing us to help work on the project of, we were responsible for developing the standard details for the guardrail and barrier, but I was also asked to present on the spec updates related to guardrail, which is sections 720 through 724. I'm going to finish out the 700 section, and I'm also going to do the updates on section 800 for traffic. So let's get started. You'll see me again this afternoon, and I'll talk more about MASH and guardrail and stuff like that. So, all right. So for the guardrail updates, section 720, a few highlights here. Generally, most of the changes were minor clarifications, listing of things in a better order. But there's a few things that I want to highlight here. So in the guardrail section in 720, clarified that the recycled composite offset blocks, which are allowable in place of the wood offset blocks, they must MASH requirements now. So no longer are we accepting any NCHRP 350 offset blocks. All of those blocks must meet MASH requirements. Within the construction section, we provided language that states that you must provide and install guardrail and components in accordance with contract documents. For those that I know I've gotten questions over reflector requirement reflectors, guardrail reflectors, the sheeting colors, and those details and the spacing details have been moved to the standard construction details, and I'll talk about those this afternoon. So that information was removed from the spec, but we did add a statement clarifying that the sheeting must meet the requirements of ASTM Type 4 sheeting. Also, for the payment, just clarified that test pits are included in the pay item for guardrail, and the items that are paid within section 720 were put in order in relationship to how they're constructed. So that's all in there. All right, so for 721, the big thing here is that we are now referencing the approved products list. So references to MASH and NCHRP 350 were removed. All devices, all end treatments, crash-worthy end treatments are now compliant, and we have an approved products list for that. So there's a link here in the slides, and I believe slides will be made available on the website, so you'll be able to get to that. But if you go to the doing business section, you'll see the approved products list. That is getting updated regularly as we get new devices submitted for both the end treatments and the other some additional clarifications and updates throughout. We clarified the payment length for the guardrail end treatment, and that's consistent with detail B-2. I'll talk about that this afternoon. The entrance special end anchorage that is in the curb guardrail detail, reference was made to that in section 721 as well. 722, high tension cable barrier. This was added as a standard spec in the 2016 update. The section was rewritten to accommodate manufacturer's recommendations. So a lot of the references to specific installation requirements were changed to meeting manufacturer's recommendations because there's different manufacturers of the high tension cable barrier, and each one of those manufacturers has slightly different nuances with how their systems are installed. Just to, if you're looking to spec this out on a project, it's a MASH test level 4 system. To my knowledge, right now, there's only one test level 4 system available on the market. I believe some are still in development, but right now there's only one system that's available in a MASH test level 4. We require a maximum lateral deflection of 8 feet. If you're doing, multiple runs of high tension on one contract, it's one system on the entire contract. We're not going to interchange systems on one contract. And then the high tension also requires a compatible end terminal, and that end terminal is meets MASH test level 3. All right, so for concrete barrier, these are the non-bridge barriers, the roadway barriers in section 723. We have a full update of the standard details for these, and I'll talk about that a little bit more this afternoon. From a construction standpoint, we updated the requirements for the barrier or the reflector placement on the barrier based on the barrier heights. So barriers 42 inches or taller, the reflector is placed 39 inches above the final roadway surface. And if it's less than 42 inches tall, the reflector is 29 inches above the roadway surface. So that was clarified in the spec update. The payment, we clarified the backfill and black backfilling, and we added reinforcing steel and joints to the basis of pavement as well. All right, section 724, this is the last guardrail related section in 700. This might be Pittsburgh's record. I don't know, probably not, but you never know. Impact attenuators, again, references to NCHRP 350 and MASH were removed. We now have an approved products list. So contractors were selecting off of the approved products list from this point forward with anything referencing the 2020 specs. These are all MASH compliant devices that are on the APL for permanent impact attenuators. If you're using work zone related temporary impact attenuators, they have a separate approved products list. So make sure you're using them appropriately and not interchangeably, because there are different requirements for temporary impact attenuators, which is covered under section 800, division 800. All right, so moving on for section 727 fence, cleaned up a lot of the things in here related to making sure that what belonged in the details is in the details, and what's in the spec is in the spec. The detail items are not being repeated in the spec, so that clarification was made. Minor edits were made to section 727.3 related to construction, and there was a new item added for temporary construction safety fence. 760 related to pavement millings and rumble strips. Clarified that drop-offs and temporary wedging needs to be in accordance with part 6 of the METCD, and that's table 6G-1. For those who don't remember, we removed language that is redundant with the special provision 401-696, entrance, driveway, and intersection street paving surcharge. So any redundant language between 401-696 and section 760 is now in the special provision and no longer in section 760. For saw cutting and butt joints in section 762, clarified that composite pavement of asphalt over concrete will be measured as saw cutting concrete. And then sealing overcuts was referenced to section 504.3. For the section 763 initial expense and demode, clarified what operations are necessary for setting up the project and what operations are necessary for job site cleanup and demobbing the project. So, for setting up and assembling the project, initial movement of personnel and equipment to the project site, establishing the contractor's offices, shops, plants, storage areas, and sanitary facilities, other activities required by the contract and by law or regulation, other work and operations required before beginning compensable items of work, and obtaining the required insurance, bonds, and all other items required for the start of work. All that's in the spec there. You can read that in more detail. For demob, for final job site cleanup, it's basically demobilizing personnel and equipment and submitting all project closeout paperwork, including subcontractor releases, in order to meet the requirements of that spec. All right, so for section 800, this is the traffic section. So everything related to temporary traffic control, traffic signals, signs, lighting, all those items are included here. I'm not going to read all those. Those are the sections within division 800. All right, so for 801 temporary traffic control, in 801.3.5, related to travel lane and road closure restrictions, we added special events as a new category for when lane closures and turn lane closures and such shall not be completed. And those are going to be based on what's in your contract documents. They can be based on Firefly, NASCAR races, or other specific events, depending on where the project resides. But she check with traffic safety on those requirements. Also in 801, there is reference to the approved products list again. And there is an approved products list for temporary traffic control devices. And if you open that file up on the website, you'll see, I think, 7 pages now. And it's related to anything that's considered a crash-worthy device, your drums, your sign stands, type 3 barricades, TMAs, temporary impact attenuators, those types of things. So, and make sure you pay close attention to those related to MASH compliance. How they decided MASH compliance with temporary traffic control devices was a little bit more subjective compared to guardrails and transitions and such. The department had to establish sunset dates for devices that don't meet MASH. So on the APL, you'll see those sunset dates under each category. So for sign stands and type 3 barricades, they have sunset dates of January 1st of 2025. Other devices may have other sunset dates. Pay close attention to those, especially for the contractors when you're purchasing purchasing new equipment, purchasing MASH compliant devices. Once we get to those sunset dates, you're not going to be able to utilize those devices any longer on DelDOT contracts. One thing I did miss here, section 806, the basis of payment for traffic officers, the fixed unit price is now $110 per hour, and the department's going to pay for traffic officers based on a submitted invoice from the police department plus 10%. All right, some minor changes for the other sections related to temporary traffic control. Again, more in line with what Oz talked about this morning with the general active voice, imperative mood, listing of things appropriately, removing redundant statements, those types of things. Nothing major that I'll really highlight here. 817 got an overhaul, and it got an overhaul in 2016 to reflect current practices at that time. In 2020, it got another major overhaul, again, to reflect the current state of the practice in Delaware with respect to how we're installing pavement markings on our roadways. All types of pavement markings were addressed, so latex paints, epoxy markings, thermoplastic, symbols, all those things were addressed in the spec, clarifying equipment requirements. Make sure that reflectivity requirements, you refer to section 1071 in the materials division for reflectivity requirements for pavement markings. So it's just some more examples of what were changed in the pavement marking section. I would suggest that, especially for the traffic folks that are that I saw in the Zoom meeting, make sure you read this in detail so you're familiar with the requirements for the pavement markings. All right, section 818 sign panels. I don't think this is a surprise to anybody at this point, but it is now the contractor's requirement to procure and install all signs on DelDOT projects. So that means that the contractor is responsible for the fabrication and installation of the signs. The sign shop is no longer involved in the capital projects. So make sure that you're referencing the spec here related to those requirements. We did add the Delaware signs of so anything that is a Delaware specific sign, the layout requirements are in those in that book there. Same thing for section 819 signposts. Again, all signposts and associated hardware being supplied by the contractor and installed by the contractor, no longer being supplied by the sign shop. One other thing to note here for any sign related things, and even or any breakaway type structures related to traffic, we're still using NCHRP 350 devices for our signposts and our sign hardware. We don't have suitable MASH compliant devices yet, so those will be forthcoming in future updates. But for now, we're going to continue using what we've been using over the past few years. For the other sections related to signs, not many changes. We did remove in section 822 any references to overhead sign lighting. Any references to that were removed from the spec. We no longer have overhead sign structure with sign lighting on them, so no need to have that language in the spec. 831 related to conduit, we added galvanized steel conduit, HDPE, PVC, flexible metallic liquid type, and polarizer shield to the materials section, and clarified all of the construction requirements there. For cabinet bases, we added a statement that the removal and replacement of any type of pavement under the cabinet base is incidental to the cabinet base item. So keep that in mind from a construction perspective. Again, minor changes to the remaining sections there. And then the bigger change in section 850, we added a chart to include LED fixtures and HPS or high pressure sodium equivalents to the 850 section related to luminaires. So make sure that's you're referencing that when selecting the appropriate luminaires for your job. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Barry to carry us to 900.
Thank you, Adam. I know everybody out there is probably sad, but we've only got a few slides on specs left. So enjoy them while you can. It's obviously going to be a lot more tense in the office now, Mike. But I will remind you that the Ravens are basically coming off 2 straight bye weeks. They played the Eagles and then they had an actual bye, so it might actually be a close game. All right, so section 900, it went under a big, actually it was created in the 2016 specs. And it had some revisions here, but we captured these in 4 slides. So the first one is section 901. And although it was pretty clear in the 2016 specs, there must have been some ambiguity. So it has been taken completely out. We define who the responsible person is in 901.1. In 901.3, we ensure that the responsible person oversees implementation of the sediment and stormwater management plan, and that is the contractor's responsible person. And we clarified responsibility also in 901.3. And like I said, all this information was in the 2016 spec as well, but it is definitely a lot more clear in the 2020. Section 903 on pollution prevention. Of note, we've just added a link in there to the DENREC website, which has a Delaware Erosion and Sediment Control Handbook in it. So that way, instead, if they change things, it's automatically going to be updated here in our spec. The next 2 points were in the 2016 spec, but if you look at 903 now, it's just 1 page. It's a very succinct. In the 2016 spec, it would say how to handle these washout operations. Now it just says, these are a list of your prohibited discharges. And then the list is there. And also under cleanup methods, just very clear here, do not hose down surfaces after spills and use dry cleanup methods only. So again, just a lot of clarification. Under section 905, sediment trapping devices, we have a new item here. We've always had silk fence and reinforced silk fence. Then we have super silk fence, which is complete with chain link fence. No cape, just chain link fence. 906, under dewatering practices, we added in there an approved equal sediment tank in addition to a portable sediment tank. And under 907, water control practices, and this is consistent throughout here, but just to outline that we inspect weekly and immediately after every rainfall to make repairs as needed. Under 907 stone check dams, now we have it's just check dam, and included in that is a compost filter log section, which is an option now for check dams, and that is also, you'll see, updated in the standard details. Just a minor changes in section 908. Section 909, water construction practices, again, just for uniformity and clarity, inspect weekly and immediately after every rainfall, make repairs as needed. And under 911 plantings, in the 2016 spec, specifically with regard to watering, it referenced you to 1021, which was water for Portland cement concrete. And also the watering requirements were in the basis of payment. And now everything is just brought up into the materials section and is very clear and listed there for anyone to see. Also, it requires the document of the watering and a breakout sheet. So that brings me to the end of this presentation. And it's too much to cover in one presentation. And we could have been here for 8 hours, but trust me, I know nobody wants that. We tried to highlight the key points, but there's no substitute for reading the specifications. I used to work, when I first came on with DelDOT, I worked for Doug Finney, and I remember we would get questions, project would be in construction, I would go to him and say, Doug, contractor wants to know this. And Doug would always say, what do the plans say? What do the specs say? What do the standard details say? I was a new engineer, and I'd be like, I don't know. He'd say, okay, go read them, and then we'll have the conversation. Usually the answer was there. So no substitute for that. Please take the time to, whether you're a designer or in construction, take the time to read your specs. I'm going to turn it back over to Oz. He's got a couple of wrap-up items for you. Oz?
So just to kind of end this morning, it's 1 minute to 11. So we've got a few questions and answers. We've been keeping up in the presentation. So please take a look at those. Hopefully we've been able to help with anything that has a question. Please feel free to email Danny, myself, any questions, and we'll pass it along. You may have to go to future revision committee questions, things of that form. So may not have all the answers, but we've definitely learned quite a bit on the way. Definitely want to appreciate the presentation Barry, Adam, Mike presented today. Just also the PDHs, just for those that will need, please be aware Sandy will send out an email to folks for the evaluation. Please turn the evaluation in, kind of like the winter workshop was earlier this year, that the evaluation will count towards your PDHs allowance. Just want to make sure everyone's aware of that. So it's 11 o'clock. Reconvene at 1 o'clock, 1 to 3. We'll go over the details, more into the major changes into the barrier section. So we'll hear more from Adam and Barry in that sense. So thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's 1 o'clock, so wanting to start the second half of the presentation today of the 2020 introduction for specs, standard specification, and standard details. Jim Osborne again, and this afternoon we'll have Barry Benton with DPI and Adam Weiser with WRN. A couple reminders, PDHs, the evaluations will be sent out at late after this presentation, after the presentations. Please turn the evaluations back in so that we can get the PDHs associated with everyone. A few other perspectives of today. This morning we discussed kind of more of the specifications, and this afternoon, so from T now and 3, we're going to talk more of the details. The raise hand feature on Zoom, we're being recorded, we are on Zoom, we are being recorded. The raise hand feature has been disabled, but the Q&A is still available. So we're going through and trying to answer questions. If you have any specific emails, please forward those along to Danny and myself, and we'll try to answer the best that we can and get the information out. So if we have time at the end, this morning we did not. We'll see what this afternoon brings. Be able to bring any of those questions up and proceed forward. Just wanted to introduce Adam. He will be discussing the barrier section, and then after that, be Barry going into the remainder detail. So, thank you for coming. Thank you for participating, and we'll look forward to learning a little bit more. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you all enjoyed your lunch. I had to go outside, get some fresh air to get away from the Pittsburgh Steelers fan, but you know, it is what it is. So I want to talk about now, I want to get into the details and talk about guardrail and barrier. We had a lot of updates for the barrier section of the standard details. So I'm going to cover crash testing and MASH. I know earlier, the earlier session in the morning, Mike Nolan covered a little bit of MASH. I'm going to reiterate a few of those items just in case we have some new people on the Zoom meeting today that didn't quite hear what Mike was talking about, because it has a similar application to the guardrail and the roadside barrier and median barrier details that I'm going to talk about. I'm also going to touch on where DelDOT is at with MASH compliance. As Mike mentioned earlier this morning, we have the sunset dates from the AASHTO FHWA Joint Implementation Agreement. So I'm going to talk about where DelDOT stands with those. And then I'll get into the guardrail and the concrete barrier details. So FHWA policy does require that roadside appurtenances used on the national highway system meet the performance criteria contained in MASH. This language is directly out of the roadside design guide. The requirements apply to traffic barriers, barrier terminals, or what we call end treatments or end terminals. I think we use the various terms loosely. Crash cushions or impact attenuators, bridge railings, which Mike talked about earlier today, sign and light pole supports, as well as work zone hardware. There's been some form of crash testing since the 19th. Maybe one of the first crash test videos that was ever done. Just going to throw that in there for a little levity. Cable barrier system. I think ours are a little bit better now. So it's just a timeline of crash testing history as far as documented crash testing guidelines, starting within the early 1960s, all the way up through the 2016 MASH, which is the second edition of MASH. The big push for crash testing documentation or guidance was in the early 80s with NCHRP 230, and then in 1993 with NCHRP 350. So what is MASH? Again, kind of a little bit of a repeat of what Mike talked about this morning, but MASH is the AASHTO manual for assessing safety hardware. The first edition was published in 2009 and replaced NCHRP Report 350. It provides guidelines nationally for crash testing of roadside safety hardware. And these are uniform guidelines that are used by all testing facilities that are testing these types of harnesses. And generally we have testing done through the Midwest Roadside Safety Facility at the University of Nebraska and the Texas Transportation Institute at Texas A&M University. There's also some private crash testing facilities as well that are generally used for some of the work zone hardware and things of that nature. The MASH was developed under NCHRP Project 2214-02. That project set to develop an update to NCHRP 350, as well as taking those updated guidelines and actually putting them into practice and testing different devices to see whether or not they actually, those existing devices would meet the MASH criteria, and to find out if the MASH criteria was useful or was going to completely change the world of roadside hardware. There was a second edition published in 2016, and I'll get into some of the differences between the original version of MASH and the new version, as well as an errata issued in June and July of 2020, clarifying some of the stuff in the second edition. So some differences under MASH, just a reminder again from this morning. One of the big differences is updating the test vehicle fleet to reflect the current vehicle fleet. So out with the Geo Metro from NCHRP 350 and in with the Ford Focus or similar types of vehicles, basically providing for the heavier small car as the small car designs changed over the years. The pickup truck went from a two-door pickup truck to a quad cab style pickup truck with which they have higher bumper height, differences in centers of gravity, which all affect how these vehicles react when impacting roadside hardware. Some of the inconsistencies in the different test matrices were updated. There's some accountability for real-world scenarios, more so than what was accounted for in NCHRP 350. As Mike alluded to, talked about in detail, there's updated evaluation criteria in MASH that reduce some of the subjectivity, especially related to passenger compartment deformation thresholds that were really subjective in NCHRP 350, and that's had a huge impact on where we're at with some of the MASH, the crash testing of roadside hardware, especially with signposts and the new requirements for minimum windshield deformation. That's part of the reason why we don't have MASH suitable signposts yet. Just a brief summary of the different test levels. We have test levels 1 through 6, and each test level has a test vehicle that's associated with it. Test level 6 includes the tractor trailer, which is about 80,000 pounds, as well as test level 5. Test level 4 includes a single unit truck, and that weight was changed from approximately 17,000 pounds to 22,000 pounds. And the speed at which the impact would occur was changed from 56 miles to 50 miles per hour. Generally, we test for things around test level 2 or test level 3 criteria. We use test level 4 more for and test level 5 now for roadside barrier and bridge abutments, where a stronger type of system to handle situations where we have more trucks in the vehicle mix on the roadways. So MASH 2009 versus 2016, there was a major update in the second edition of MASH that added new criteria for cable barriers on slopes. Some agencies will have some fairly steep roadside slopes in their medians, and there was some testing matrices provided for crash testing cable barriers on those slopes. Some minor updates within MASH 2016, some updates to the soil strength testing, improved documentation of vehicle damage, and they updated the tractor trailer lengths for test level 5 and 6 vehicles to be slightly longer than what they were in the 2009 edition. The other difference is how FHWA and AASHTO approached implementation of MASH between the 2009 and 2016 version. In 2009, when MASH was first introduced, it was anticipated that manufacturers would just kind of fall into place and follow along with the new guidelines and start developing MASH compliant devices. And so there were no sunset requirements of NCHRT 350 devices. The issue here is that there were some safety benefits that were never realized because we didn't have sunset dates for NCHRP 350 devices. So when the second edition of MASH was developed, FHWA and AASHTO introduced the joint implementation agreement and introduced sunset dates for non-MASH compliant roadside hardware. And they're listed here on the slide, but in general, W-beam barriers and cast-in-place concrete barriers were the first to be sunset at the end of December of 2017. W-beam terminals in June of 2018, cable barriers and cable barrier terminals, and also crash cushions at the end of 2018. And then at the end of 2019, really pretty much the rest of the roadside hardware as far as bridge railing transitions and all the longitudinal barriers were sunsetted. That includes sign supports and other breakaway hardware. And again, I'll get into where DelDOT stands on these requirements. Work zone devices and slightly different requirements. I'm not going to get into that in this presentation, but if you have questions about those, you can let this traffic safety section know, or you can email me directly. Mike talked a little bit about this morning as well. MASH compliance is determined by the user agency, and this is based on guidance issued by the FHW has a long-standing policy that all roadside safety hardware is to be crash-worthy. That's installed on the NHS. Roadside safety hardware is eligible for federal funding if it's been determined to be crash-worthy by the user agency. So in this case, DelDOT needs to make the determination if a particular device is crash-worthy. There's a couple different ways we could do that. We could do that through reviewing crash testing documentation, through self-certification from manufacturers, or by doing specific, for example, on our bridge parapets and the roadside barrier work that was done as part of this update. There were some additional analyses that were done to determine if they met the appropriate requirements or guidance. If we have a situation where there's a device that we want to use that doesn't meet MASH, there is guidance that the FHWA put out that allows us to use NCHRP 350 compliant devices in the absence of a suitable MASH alternative. Posts and our luminaire supports, as well as some work zone hardware. But from a guardrail standpoint, most of our new details are MASH compliant in most cases, and I'll get into a few of those in a few minutes. So how are we doing at DelDOT with MASH compliance? W-beam barrier, the terminals, cast-in-place concrete barrier, bridge railing, cable barrier, cable terminals, transitions, all of the longitudinal barriers and all of the terminals are in general meeting MASH, or we're in compliance with MASH as far as meeting the requirements of the sunset dates. W-beam terminals and the crash cushions, or what we call permanent impact attenuators, refer to the approved products list for those devices. And those you will see only MASH devices on those lists that we allow for installation from this point forward. So any contract going out now is going to have a MASH compliant device for a permanent situation. Cable barrier and cable terminals, that's addressed through the spec. The remainder of the W-beam and the barrier, that's addressed through the standard details. And then sign supports and other breakaway hardware, as I mentioned, we're still using 350 devices, and those will be in use until we have suitable MASH compliant devices available. For work zone devices, make sure you check the approved products list. There are state specific sunset dates for all those work zone devices that need to be referred to from this point moving forward. So the other thing that we're looking at as far as MASH compliance is how do we address MASH compliance moving forward with new details that might come out, or we might want to develop new details or new products that are pushed to us by vendors. How do we determine if we're going to allow them to be installed on our roadways? So there's a policy implement forthcoming, and Mark Lex allowed me to kind of present a little bit of information on this, and it would still, the policy implement is still in draft form, but it's basically formalizing the existing MASH committee as a standing committee within DelDOT. And the purpose will be, their main purpose is to be the technical group regarding roadside safety hardware. And it's not just one person, it's a complement of various groups within the department that have specific expertise that collectively will be able to make appropriate decisions with regards to roadside safety hardware. They will be reviewing crash testing paperwork, making recommendations to add devices to the approved products list, establishing Delaware specific sunset dates, which some of that's already been done for the work zone devices. From hardware approval standpoints, if hardware has an approved crash testing from a recognized crash test facility, the device may be approved without self-certification. But if a device does not have that crash test documentation, the department will be responsible for doing that self-certification. And it will be looking at why crash tested hardware cannot be, why specific crash tested hardware cannot be used, and why a non-crash tested piece or something that hasn't been crash tested with previous standards, why we would rather use that than something that's crash tested. Justification with appropriate engineering calculations regarding why the hardware is acceptable. That self-certification is going to be prepared by the group that within DelDOT that's the appropriate subject matter expert. So, for example, if there's a new type of bridge barrier that the bridge section wants to use, and there's not a lot of crash testing documentation, the bridge section will be responsible for developing that sort of self-certification. And then that's going to get reviewed and voted on by the MASH committee. And if it's recommended by the MASH committee, it'll go to the chief engineer for consideration. So more on that will be coming once the policy implement is finalized and out for consumption. All right, so enough about MASH. In those details, I want to get into the actual new guardrail details that we've developed. So from an overall update for the standard construction details, we did an overall compliance review related to MASH. We looked at the existing details to make sure that they were consistent with MASH tested devices. We eliminated non-compliant details. We updated existing details as needed or where appropriate. Some NCHRP 350 details were maintained in the 2020 edition of the standard construction details and for various reasons. We removed the metric dimensions from all the detail sheets. We added a few new details as well. Some of these I think are going to be very useful for the department moving forward, especially type 131 guardrail with omitted post, and that can be used with and without curve. Type 131 guardrail on a steep slope. The new guardrail to barrier connection that Mike talked about this morning, which includes the concrete buttress or the end post as we called it. There's a revised end anchorage detail and a revised buried in back slope detail. Those are all meeting MASH. Just a list of the details within the guardrail section. So going from B1, the guardrail applications, all the way through to B20, which is the buried in back slope, and I'll go through each of these. So from a guardrail application standpoint, this is detail B1, covers the type 131, the type 231, and the type 331, which is the median guardrail. So type 131, that's been considered MASH compliant for a while now. We also call that the Midwest Guardrail System, or you might hear the term MGS. It's our standard guardrail application. It is the basis for all other guardrail details that we have. The height of the guardrail is 31 inches. We refer to this as spacing, which is 6'3" or 75 inches. Generally, we'll use 12-inch offset blocks. The minimum clearance to the obstruction is 4 feet. The guardrail splices are at mid-span, so that's going to be a big deal and a big thing to look out for in the field. If you're installing a 31-inch guardrail with 6'3" post spacing and your splices are at the post, it's wrong. They need to be installed mid-span. This is considered a MASH compliant system. The type 231, which is considered half post spacing, 3 foot 1.5 inches or 37.5 inches. This is an NCHRP 350 compliant device. MASH testing is still underway with this system. They're having some issues with transitioning from the standard post spacing to the half post spacing. So for now, until we have a suitable alternative that's MASH compliant, we'll be utilizing the existing 231 detail. The 331 detail was revised. This is the median guardrail or double-sided guardrail. Requires the use of 8-inch offset blocks. That's a difference from the previous details where we were using 12-inch offset blocks. The testing on this was done only with 8-inch offset blocks. It does utilize the standard post spacing similar to the type 131, except it's just double-sided rail. This is a crash test of the MGS or our type 131 rail with the Dodge Ram pickup truck. This is a TL3 test. And that was a passing test, obviously. Just some things to note on the detail sheets. Again, just for everybody's information, type 131 and 331 are MASH compliant systems, and the 231 is an NCHRP 350 compliant system. One thing we did do is, where appropriate, we actually referenced a particular FHWA eligibility letter for the MASH compliance, or if one did not exist. Oh, I lost my slides. Oh, maybe that's me. There we go. Thank you. If we reference the FHWA eligibility letter. If a letter did not exist, then we reference the crash test report. So as you can see on the slide or in the detail, it's for the type 131 guardrail, we have a reference to the FHWA eligibility letter B-212, and the type 331, we actually reference the crash test report since there's no eligibility letter associated with that. The sheet 2 in the B1 series, no changes were made there except removing any metric dimensions that were on that sheet. The rest of the dimensions themselves stayed the same, as well as the layout. Most of the changes in the B1 series were made on sheet 3 with respect to where curb is utilized. So in the top left of the sheet, you'll see this detail here. This is the shoulder application of guardrail. We revised the curb placement allowances based on MASH testing. So for posted speeds less than or equal to 50 miles per hour, the curb height is less than or equal to 6 inches. But once we go over 50 miles per hour, the curb height is reduced to no more than 4 inches. One issue that we tried to resolve related to field concerns is the tolerance between the face of the rail and the face of the curb. Flush is always preferred. We want the face of the rail flush with the face of the curb. But in some cases, there is an allowance where this no more than 6 inches behind the face of the curb to the face of the guardrail. That's in that situation that would be allowed, no more than 6 inches. We did revise the offset point to the offset to the hinge point behind the post to 3 feet. One thing to note also from a maintenance strip standpoint, make sure that you're speccing out the maintenance strip on your plans, and we want to make sure those sections are as thin as possible to allow for the post rotation. Related to the median guardrail on sheet 3, this is the top right part of the figure. 8-inch offset blocks only. We identified more detail related to the curb. So now when curb is required, it's a type 1-2 curb, and Barry will talk more in detail about the physical curb detail, but it's shown here on the guardrail section as well. And it's only when curb is required. Related to offsetting your guardrail from the face of curb, this was revised greatly, and it's now only permitted for situations where your posted speed is less than 45 miles per hour, and this is based on crash testing. So when you have a posted speed less than 45 miles per hour, you can offset your guardrail between 4 feet and 12 feet. And the height of the guardrail is 6 inches maximum. The height of the guardrail with respect to the top of curb is 31 inches maximum, 31 to 32 inches. And the height of the guardrail directly at the face of the rail is no more than 34 inches. So when you're looking at a situation like this, your grading is going to be extremely important to make sure that at the physical guardrail face, that the guardrail height above the ground at that location is no more than 34 inches. That's important. The reason why we don't this was the test of the fleet, which that test is done at 62 miles per hour, and that truck rolled and that failed test right there. So there'll probably be more testing on this in the future, but as of now, the situation offset from the face from the curb is only allowed for speeds less than 45 miles per hour. A new application, this is sheet 4, which is a new sheet in the B1 series. This is type 131 guardrail with an omitted post. As you can see in the detail, there is one post that is removed. So basically creates a 12-foot 6-inch gap between the two remaining posts. When in this situation, when the, let me show the crash test first. This is just a crash test. This is a good situation if we have like a curb opening that we need to span, something small that we need to span, maybe a utility obstruction underground. We can omit that post in some cases, not in every case. This can be used with and without curb. So the curb requirements are going to be based on sheet 3 of detail B1. Nested guardrail within the limit of payment in this system is used when curb is present. So if we have curb within the limits of the guardrail, within the payment limits of the guardrail with omitted post, we're using nested 2 sections of W-beam guardrail nested together. And that's clear, that's shown in the detail. If there's no curb, then we don't need to nest the guardrail. Where we can omit the post is extremely important when it comes into the distance from our end treatments. So on the detail, you'll see the distance from the type 131 guardrail end treatment, 231 guardrail end terminal, and from the end anchorage all have specific distances from where the first post can be omitted upstream or downstream from those devices. So pay from a design perspective, pay close attention to that when you're laying out your guardrail, and make sure that you're meeting those requirements. Another new detail added in the B1 series is the type 131 on a steep slope. So this allows us to install guardrail on a 2-to-1 slope, and the face of the rail is in line in this case. So there is a maintenance strip called out and it's per plans. So if you have a maintenance strip on your plans, the detail shows where that maintenance strip gets installed. Within the limits of payment for the steep slope design, the posts, which are 3 through 8 here on the detail, are 8 foot long. And on those posts, we use 8-inch offset blocks. So everything leading into and out of this system with the regular type 131 would use 12-inch offset blocks. But once we get into the steep slope design, we're using 8-foot posts and 8-inch offset blocks. Quick crash test of this system here. little hard to see, but an idea. All right, so on to D2, grading for guardrail entry treatments. And I want to be clear that this is only for grading. This is not the detail for how to install a guardrail end terminal. Those installation details are in the manufacturer's installation instructions. And make sure that we're referring to the approved products list for the allowable devices that can be used. This detail shows the grading requirements that are in advance of the end treatment and within the limits of the payment limits of the end treatment. It's a 50-foot payment limit as far as the end treatment goes, but there's 75 feet of advanced grading requirements in advance of the end terminal. A couple things to note here. We have a curb height within the limits of the grading of no more than 2 inches. And there's no guardrail reflectors within the limits of the end treatment. So the guardrail reflectors are installed beyond the limit of payment of your end treatment. All dimensions on this detail were revised to be measured from the face of the rail rather than the back of the post. The back of the rail is a little inconsistent in the past. So all dimensions for the grading purposes are based on the face of the rail. For the type 2 end treatment, basically the details are the same or similar as far as the updates. Curb height no more than 2 inches, dimensions from the face of the rail, and no guardrail reflectors within the limits of the end treatment. And just to note here, right now we only have one approved type 2 MASH compliant end treatment on the APL. The type 3, which is your median terminal, this grading detail was updated to account for transition grading and on the approach. So it's a 50-foot minimum area, or is shown on your plans for transition grading. And then beyond that transition grading, then it's a 10-to-1 or flatter slope approaching the nose of the end terminal. Curb is depressed to 2 inches maximum height. And again, no guardrail reflectors within the limits of the end treatment. I keep wanting to say any questions, but I don't know if anybody wants to ask me questions. Guardrail over culverts, detail B3, some minor changes here. The minimum offset from the wing wall to the back of the post was changed to 12 inches, and that's just in coordination with the crash testing that was done for this system. So I was just making sure that we clarified that dimension. Within the limits of the guardrail over culvert, a maximum of 2-inch height curb may be used when the curb is called out on the plans. 231, same changes here, except one additional change. There was a discrepancy with the posts, the wood posts within the limits of the guardrail over culvert. So it was clarified that posts 2 through 7, as shown in the detail here, are to be the type 31 long wood breakaway posts. Type post 1 and post 8, which are the outside posts there, are to be this regular standard steel posts that we use on other guardrail systems. 331. Guardrail over culvert, again, the same changes here as far as the offset from the wing wall to the back of the post and the 2-inch curb height. The differences between the 131, 231, and 331 is basically the span of the culvert. So for type 131, it's a 12-foot 6-inch span. 231, it's an 18-foot 9-inch span, and then 331, it's a 25-foot span. We cannot have a span longer than 25 feet for this type of detail. Some might be asking, well, where would I use the guardrail with omitted post versus the guardrail over culvert? So for the guardrail with omitted post, the new detail that I showed earlier, we're only going to use this where only one post needs to be omitted, or we're doing a small span of a curb opening or an underground utility conflict, something of that nature. The guardrail over culvert is reserved for what is called for using the span pipe for box culverts and for unsupported span lengths between 12-foot 6 and 25 foot. And the max span length, as I mentioned before, is 25 feet. So they're not to be used interchangeably. They each have their purpose. Just make sure that you're using the correct detail. The end anchorage was updated to meet MASH compliant testing. There's no curb used within the limits of the end anchorage. We verified with the developer, I believe it was Midwest Roadside Safety Facility, about the use of curb with this system, and they said it was not tested with curb. They did not recommend utilizing curb, and they actually recommended stopping your curb at a distance upstream from the end of the end anchorage, which is what we call the knuckle. Detail B-7, this is the transition for your guardrail height from 31 inch to 27 inch. We revised the detail slightly to be consistent with published guidance from the Midwest Roadside Safety Facility. Basically, you're looking at, this is the detail that you're to use when you're transitioning your height from 31 inch to 27 inch, and also allows you to transfer or transition the location of the splice. So if you recall, the type 131, the splice is mid-span between the posts, and on the type 127, your splice occurs at the post. So this design allows that transition to occur in an appropriate fashion. I've seen a lot of situations where we've just taken the guardrail and just angled it, and just to get that height transition. But you also need to make sure that we're transitioning the splice properly. So this detail has to be used and should be called out on your plans when it's applicable. Approach guardrail transitions. This detail here was our old B-5. This is the type 131 guardrail to barrier connection. This was retained. It's consistent with early MASH testing. So some of the initial testing that was done when MASH was first developed. This design is consistent with a similar detail that was developed, that was tested with MASH. But this is pretty much only to be used in retrofit situations. We have now, as Mike alluded to, we have the type 331, which is the dry beam transition with the end post. That's the preference for new construction. This is the exit connection. So on a divided highway where you don't have opposing traffic that could strike the end of your concrete barrier, you would use the guardrail to barrier connection exit type. And this is not a crash tested system. It is simply just transitioning from your barrier to your guardrail. And this is reducing as you're approaching the guardrail. Whereas if it was an approach end, you would have to gradually increase the stiffness of the guardrail at the barrier connection. So there's no crash testing associated with this. It's simply a detail for how we transition from barrier to guardrail, coming off of a barrier wall where we don't have opposing traffic that could strike the end of that wall. This was formerly sheet 6 of 6 in detail B5. It's now detail B-8. I believe it's sheet 4. Detail B-10 is the new guardrail to barrier connection type 331. This is the transition that Mike talked about this morning, where we're transitioning from W-beam to a thrive beam attachment, and then attaching that thrive beam to a concrete buttress or an end post. This is the basic layout of the end treatment, or I'm sorry, the transition. This can be utilized with curb. If we're using curb, the upstream end of the W-beam, the first 12 foot 6 inches off of the thrive beam to W-beam transition, that needs to be 2 nested sections of W-beam guardrail. If there's no curb, it only needs to be 1 section of W-beam guardrail. And that's spelled out in the notes. We have a symmetric W-beam to thrive beam transition to transition the height of the W-beam to the thrive beam. And then we have a 6'3" section of thrive beam guardrail, and then a 12 foot 6 inch nested section of thrive beam guardrail attaching to the end post or the concrete buttress. There are specific post requirements. There are specific offset block requirements. Make sure from a construction perspective, we're paying attention to those. Those are on these. We'll play the crash test. Is it playing in here? Okay. This is just a different view of the crash test that Mike showed earlier. These are additional sheets that show the specific post details for the various post sizes leading into the transition. So pay attention to the offset block and the post size requirements here. as well as the end shoe detail for the thriving. From a design perspective, for utilizing the different approach guardrail transitions, the Type 131, which is one of our existing details, is to be used for retrofit applications and existing F-shaped barrier wall attachments. The old Type 231, which is the double stacked W-beam, that is no longer in use and failed MASH testing, so we're not going to be using that anymore. Use the Type 331 for new construction or where it's desirable to construct the concrete buttress. If you have a retrofit situation where you think the Type 331 might be beneficial, consult the MASH committee and or bridge design about that to make an appropriate decision for utilizing the 331 in a retrofit situation. Detail B11 is the concrete buttress details. There's 4 options available here. It's the vertical face, which is the original version of this detail, the end post. And then there's a transition from vertical face to the 36-inch F-shaped barrier, from vertical face to 42-inch F-shaped barrier, and vertical face to 42-inch single slope barrier. So all of these transitions are in line with the new concrete barrier details that we have that I'll talk about in a few minutes. One thing to note is your details for those, but you'll have to do some research to find the appropriate detail. There's a push nationally now to get this type of system, get a MASH tested system for transitions, but one's not available yet. You cannot use the 331 in a median situation. All right, so detail B13, barrier hardware comprises 12 sheets. For all the sheets, we remove the metrics, any metric dimensions that were on those detail sheets. We reviewed dimensions to be consistent with the AASHTO Task Force 13 standardized dimensions. So that's a guide to standardized highway barrier hardware. We want to make sure that our dimensions were consistent with that guideline. We updated sheet titles where appropriate. So some specific detail changes in the hardware section on sheet 7 related to short and long wood breakaway posts. We adjusted the ground line to be consistent with MASH crash testing for the long wood breakaway posts. I believe the original detail showed the top breakaway hole below the ground line, and it's actually supposed to be in line with the ground. We added labels to the bottom of the posts for the short and long wood breakaway posts just for clarification. So we added front and side labels just to clarify what was being referenced in that detail. Sheet 9 related to the guardrail reflector. I talked about this with the spec update. We added notes in here related to the guardrail reflector spacing, as well as the color of the sheeting, depending on which situation you're in. So if you're on a two-lane roadway and your guardrail's on the right side, the sheeting should be white for both directions of travel. But if you're on the divided highway or a ramp on the left side, you should have yellow sheeting approaching traffic for approaching traffic and red sheeting for the wrong direction of travel. On the right side, situation should be white for approaching traffic and red for wrong way traffic. New sheets 11 and 12 were added. Sheet 11 is the downstream anchorage ground strut and anchor bracket. That's related to the end anchorage detail. And then sheet 12 is the Thriving terminal connector, where you terminated the Thriving into concrete barrier. That's the attachment to the barrier there. We retained guardrail applications for 27-inch. So this is detail B-15. These are only for use in maintenance of existing 27-inch high guardrail or for B17, the guardrail end treatment type 427. This is for use at entrance locations on roadways with a posted speed limit less than or equal to 40 miles per hour. To be used where standard end treatment will not fit. It is not MASH compliant. We should be striving to get MASH compliant end treatments installed where appropriate. This is where we can't get anything else to fit. B18, the curved guardrail section. This is for intersections, where we have guardrail wrapping around the intersection. Only used where absolutely necessary. There's not a suitable MASH system available. There is one MASH system that's available, which is really cumbersome as far as grading requirements go, and the need to maintain sand drum or sand barrels behind the curved guardrail section. We opted not to utilize that system and to maintain the existing system. Keep in mind that B17 here and B18 are all 27-inch high systems. They cannot be installed at 31. You will have to transition using detail B-7 from the 27-inch to the 31-inch. Take that into account when you're laying this out. Also, B18, when you're not utilizing a standard end treatment or you're not tying into an existing another run of guardrail, there is an entrance special end anchorage that would be required to terminate that curved guardrail section. And that end anchorage does require a concrete anchor underground with a cable and anchor bolt that ties to that. That is required in this detail. There's a new buried end section detail. This is detail B-20. This is a MASH compliant system replacing the original details that we had. This system does not require the concrete anchor under the hill or the embankment. I don't know. It's a little hard to see in the picture here, but the posts that are in the embankment are specifically designed for that situation. So pay attention to that from a layout perspective, but no concrete anchor is required in this design. All right, we'll touch on the concrete barrier details. All right, so again, just overall update. We did an overall MASH compliance review, which pretty much resulted in elimination of the existing concrete barrier details and replacing them with new details. We did address, for the new details, we addressed common department uses. So the goal here to try to minimize having to have project-specific concrete barrier details and have a standardized detail for our various situations. We have roadside concrete barrier details, a 36-inch F shape and a 42-inch F shape. Those are both at test level 4. And then we have median concrete barrier details, 32-inch F shape, which is a test level 3, 36-inch F shape at test level 4, 42-inch F shape at test level 4, and a 42-inch single slope at test level 5. The designs of the barrier were based on available MASH crash testing that was evaluated for research, as well as appropriate structural analyses. We actually did some yield line analyses for our structures group at WRA and documented all those results of the analysis to certify that they meet MASH requirements. So here are the details. B-25, 36-inch concrete roadside barrier. It's a test level 4 design. There's 3 application options. One where the barrier is up against a embankment that's sloping away from the top of the barrier. Type 2 is where your embankment is sloping down towards the top of the barrier, and you can see the need for the number 57 stone for drainage purposes behind the barrier, and that's that type 2 situation with the geotech separation. You see the footing requirements here, as well as the GABC requirements underneath the footing. We also have a type 3 barrier application, which is slightly different footing design. And this is a situation where you might be protecting an obstruction rather than having the barrier sit up against an embankment. These were developed for cast in place or slip forming. And there's specific notes related to the operations of the barrier. The reinforcement for the barrier is shown on the second sheet, which is right here. So the reinforcement requirements are shown on the second sheet of this detail. Similar detail, this is the B26 42-inch concrete roadside barrier. Again, it's test level 4 design. Similar application options, can be cast in place or slip formed. And again, the reinforcement is shown on sheet 2. The main difference here is really the barrier height in this situation and the rebar placement. All right, from a median barrier perspective, we have a 32-inch concrete median barrier. This is a test level 3 design. This is more for our collector roadways where we might have a need for a median barrier, something in a lower speed situation, like type of situation, maybe less truck traffic, those types of things. Again, cast in place or slip form operation for installation. And you can see the rebar requirements and the footing requirements on the detail. 36-inch F-shape median barrier. This is test level 4. 42-inch F-shape. Again, this is also test level 4. And then the final concrete median barrier detail. This is the new single slope barrier, similar to what Mike talked about with the parapet walls for the TL5 single slope. This is only for interstates, freeways, and expressways. It's a test level 5 design. Now this is a median barrier, so it's a double-sided barrier. You can use this on the roadside if need be. However, there was no crash testing of a roadside single-faced, single slope barrier. If that makes sense. So we only have, from a roadway perspective, non-bridge roadway perspective, we only have a crash tested design for a double-faced single slope barrier. Note the requirement for rebar or reinforcement in the footing for this design. That is based on the crash testing, and that's helps get it to that TL5 criteria. So that is pretty much all I have today. So this morning I covered the guardrail and barrier spec updates as well as the traffic section spec updates. For this afternoon, covered crash testing and MASH and where DelDOT stands with guardrail and concrete barrier construction. I mentioned with respect to the guardrail. Make sure you're checking your length and need calcs. From a design perspective, those length and need calcs need to be included in your design files. If we run into an issue in the field where it doesn't look like we have enough guardrail, construction should be contacting the designer to have the designer verify length and need before finalizing that project. So just keep that in mind. If there's any questions about these details or anything I've spoke about today, feel free to email Oz or Danny or myself. There's my contact information. Don't hesitate to reach out. We're gonna go ahead and take a 2-minute break.
2 o'clock.
Come back at 2 o'clock. Be a 5-minute break, I guess.
Welcome back. Thank you guys for hanging with us. Again, this is Barry Benton, if you weren't in earlier. And I'm going to be taking us through sections 2 through 8 of the standard details. A lot of changes made, some of them editorial, some of them significant. So we're going to touch on all of the sheets that were changed and try to go through it as efficiently as we can. Okay, so this is the 2020 standard details. See, first of all, I want to give thanks to Oz for letting us work on this and George Spadafino for helping put this thing together. I'm calling out George, not to give him the credit, but the blame in case something is screwed up in here. So George, I'll be quick to give it to you. You'll see in here that we have blue arrows. Anytime there is a change, you're going to see a blue arrow on your screen. So here you can see the date, and we got rid of the customary units. Okay. So with that, we're going to go directly into section 2, curb and gutter. There were 4 different revised standard details: C1, C2, C3, and C5. And as we go through the presentation, I'll have a title slide like this at the beginning of every section saying what's been revised, deleted, or added. So for this particular one, I'm going to show a side-by-side comparison. We're going to take the side-by-side comparisons down later so you can actually see it, but this is just going to show you so you can see the differences. So some of the things you note 6 and some changes to the PCC curb section on this one. So looking at it, we've added borrowed type F, topsoil and finished grade location, and JBC is no longer type B, it's just GBC. We also put it in there finished 2 inches below finished grade, both sides of the curb. One of the other things is note 6 was added, and you'll see this in the other curb details too. It just says that to install a type 4 polyurethane bonded recycled rubber expansion material between the face of the curb and the edge of the PCC pavement. Pretty simple. And the integral PCC curb and gutter has got the same revisions to it. Again, there's note 6. You're going to see the same exact changes on that typical section. There is a new sheet that was added to the standard C-1, and the new sheet just has the PCC roundabout curve, and as Adam had mentioned during his presentation, it's got a new median curve guardrail application to allow for deflection. You see it's a 5.5 inch wide curve that's got 2 inches. So that is there, and there's where that would be, or it's a 6 inch, sorry, 6 inch wide curve. There's where it would be installed. Standard C-2 pedestrian connections type 1. So some of the things that were added to slope 20 to 1 max, see note 9, and note 9 says that the running slope of the pedestrian connection is 5% or less. With no required turn movements, the laning can be omitted as it is a blended transition, and detectable warning surface to be installed as directed by the manager. On sheet 2 of 3, you see we added note 10, and note 10 just gives you direction on where to install the detectable warning surface on a radius. And on sheet 3 of 3, this one changed in the presentation some for the pedestrian connection type 5. There was information on this sheet showing the adjacent connections on the other side, and that really wasn't relevant to this. Plus, there's a note stating that we changed from 3 inches to 8 inches behind the pavement edge when there's no curb as to where the detectable warning is. Pretty simple stuff. For entrances on the C3, a few things here. If the width of the driveway is 15 feet or greater, the flare extensions can be omitted. That was there before that note was removed. And a note was added about the sidewalk running slope of 5% is preferred with allowance to follow the adjacent road grades. Sidewalk grade exceeding the adjacent road grades of 5% must then maintain a maximum of 12 to 1 or 8.3 running slope. For concrete entrances, the PCC is paid as sidewalk. And for paving sections, plans must include a paving section and payment for it. That's for an entrance without sidewalk. On the curb sidewalk opening, you see the circled note down there. And that just says that when you don't have an adjacent curb, your slab width has to be 12 inches wider than the sidewalk on both sides where you have the curb or sidewalk. So we'll move forward now to section 3, the drainage. So there's a number of them that got revised. You see there's a total of 7 that got revised. There's a new detail sheet for the round manhole cover slab. And there's been a couple of standards removed from the standard detail. So the former D7, the junction box detail, presented an issue for pipe maintenance. So that one was removed. And also the safety metal end section was removed because we removed metal pipe from section 601. So here is the drainage inlet reference sheet. So first thing, we removed the 12-inch pipe. We removed note 7. Okay. We added note 9, which says to extend the pipe to be flush with the inside of the wall of the inlet box in accordance with the standard specifications. And we also added note 11, which says install steps in accordance with section 602.3.b when inlets are 4 feet or deeper from the top of the grate to the inverted lowest pipe. We also changed the dimensions to make them more definitive and wall reinforcements code. Additionally, before there was a 1.5-inch minimum. That's been changed. Note 10 to just say pipe shall not encroach on the adjacent wall. No longer requiring that minimum. For the drainage inlet assembly, added the water flow arrow, added a 2x4 temporary drainage opening. For the drainage inlet cover slab, so this was the former picture you see, and we just removed the joint. They're omitted from the plan views for clarity, and added note 5 to state that. Just to help clarify the sheet. So. And then from the standard specifications, use drainage inlet frames and grates and manhole frames and covers capable of meeting or exceeding HS25 load rating requirements in accordance with AASHTO M306. As I said before, the HS25, we use HL93 and bridges now, the actual loads are the same. The doghouse inlet box had just some more detail added to it. You see, we call out a minimum thickness for the slab, a maximum height of the doghouse inlet, which goes up now. We added the 1 foot minimum of number 57 stone. Inside of the doghouse, you see number 8 says that inside the doghouse structure, remove the existing pipe by saw cutting flush with the face. Alternatively, can remove the top half of the pipe and use remaining pipe section as the bottom of the flow channel. And in the previous drawing, if you were to look at it side by side, that wasn't shown. So it's just the pipe is shown now as being cut to be as a flow channel. For the box manhole assembly, this one has a title change. Also the notes and change the top unit to grade ring, change the naming of some of these, just for consistency. This particular detail, a lot of detail was added to it. It was very plain before, so you can see we added the 12-inch minimum dimension between pipes, the 8-inch minimum it's just adding more detail to the round manhole assembly. It was kind of, it was missing a lot of this one. And then all the cast in place concrete flow channel. All right, the manhole grade ring, top unit, frame, and cover. That's the next one. It's sheet 3 of 5. Title change for this one. Change top unit to grade ring as we did before. Notes were added for clarification. We have a new detail over here. This was one I had talked about before, was added. And here's more information. This is the round manhole cover slab. Okay, the pipe bedding and pipe flared end support. So for this one, we added the end sections for the concrete pipe. This is new. And it goes in line with the standard specification 601.3.5 flared end section. And E, you see place support footer in accordance with standard construction details. That would be the concrete cutoff wall under the flared end section. Okay. The next detail is the perforated pipe under drain. Hey, Oz, can we get this screen down so I can see the bottom as well? All right, thank you.
That's on your view. That's on your view.
I don't know how to change
Go
it.
up to the top, grab the mouse. Go up to view options.
Just popped up. Excuse me while I.
Yep. I saw it.
Yeah, it keeps disappearing. I don't know if it's not reading it.
Here, I'll tell you what.
I'll keep moving. I have something on my monitor here that's so the perforated pipe under drain detail. Keep moving. So we added a dimension. Added a delineator location. Added the delineator location for it. And on the pipe plugging detail, we just changed the material to the flow before. The next section that we're going to talk about is section 4, erosion. And there were a lot of details on this particular one that a lot of details on here that were revised. You can see I guess we got a total of 13 of them revised, and a number that have been removed from the standard details. So E11, incremental stabilization, contract plans and duration will determine the stabilization requirement. And then for the E12 and E13, which is the erosion control blanket and the turf reinforcement mat, those will be now from an approved products list, and they're installed per the manufacturer's recommendations. So there's no need for a standard detail on those anymore. So those are all removed. So the first one, the concrete washout, added a note just to connect the access drive to a paved or gravel surface. And put a slope of 50:1 was added in there as well. All of the notes down here were edited to be in accordance with DENREC details, and you'll see this comment come up on a few of these. We just wanted to make sure we were in conformance with DENREC. This is the silk fence detail. So remove the 4-inch leg from the buried fabric material. It used to go down 4 and over 4, now it just goes down 8. And again, edited the notes so that they were in accordance with the DENREC details. Also called out hardwood stain. This is what we referred to earlier in the standard specs, the super silk fence detail. So the super silk fence reduced from 33 inches to 24 inches. Again, remove the 4-inch leg from the buried fabric material. Now it just is embedded 8 inches straight. And the notes were edited in accordance with the DENREC details. Next is a sediment trap. Added note 7, if R4 riprap is utilized on the downstream side of the sediment trap, choke the R4 riprap with Delaware number 3 stone on the flow face. Here on this detail, you see wood frame replaced with post and fence in accordance with the DENREC detail. So before there used to be a wood frame on the inlet protection. Now it's just post and fence. Also, formerly there was a stone check dam outside of this, and that stone check dam has been removed. Note was added which allows a compost filter log, and it just says paid separately from sediment control drainage. Here is notes and details edited in accordance with the DENREC details. Increased minimum distance to 6 foot on the compost filter log or stone. And 5 foot maximum spacing for the stakes. Added in. Also 18-inch height added to the detail as well. And this can be either R4 riprap or a compost log. Here's the portable sediment tank detail. So some things added to here. The depth of the clean out changed from 24 inches to 1/3 of the depth. For the skimmer dewatering device, added note 4. For any non-typical skimmer outlet connection, submit a shop drawing for engineer approval. So for the stone check dam details, the title was changed to just check dams. And the reason for that is that now it's not necessarily have to be a stone check dam. So what we're showing there was the stone check dam, but here's also the compost filter log check dam, which is permitted as well. And this is a new detail. So of note the staking requirements. The temporary slope drain detail, E-10. So added dimensions for the R4 riprap, pretty minor stuff here, but added hold down stakes and outfall for riprap. Dimension is not recessed. Okay, so it's dimensioned and it's not recessed. It's changed from before. And also added a new note 4, which just says for all temporary slope drains, use a minimum of 3 hold down stakes spaced evenly throughout the whole length, beginning at the pipe outlet into the R4. The geotextile line channel diversion. So it changed from maximum capacity to stream-based flow. So, and then the stilling well, some things of note, the stone is not excavated into the stream bed, and we also removed the float from the clean water district, and also removed the 6-inch minimum freedom, and added a 9-inch minimum depth of riprap. And it's all just on top of the ground. So also added note 2, no stream bed material should be allowed to pass through the dewatering hose. Should go without saying, but it doesn't. The stone outlet detail. So adjusted the geotextile lapping not to go under the roadway. Before this, it used to go under the GABC, which obviously would cause some constructability issues. Probably wouldn't put in at the time that that was in there. So moving on to section 6, the miscellaneous details. The number of revised standard details on here. We've got 7 of them that are revised, and we have 6 revised and 1 of them that's new, which is the temporary pedestrian pathway. Looks like, can you catch me back up? Okay, went back into something on. Where did I hit? I hit the wrong button. All right. We'll go again. All right, so the right-of-way monumentation, M-2, just added a triangle with X for the aluminum cap, and revised the note to not change for the concrete minor replacement by 2 minutes or PCC. We want them to be flush. With those. The shared use path and sidewalk, we added typical sections, didn't used to be there before. Material depth and side slopes are shown. See, so there's the material depth and side slopes. Revise the notes for the wood rail fence. Just add a note, fence to be located outside the clear zone or along low speed areas as directed by the engineer. Chain link fence details. Revised notes, added note 8, install all fences outside the clear zone. For the bus stop pad types 1, 2, and 3. Change, you see the notes at the bottom, all notes now match the pedestrian accessibility standard requirements. Also, a material key was added to this detail. And just some CAD things, hatching provided to clarify. The bus stop pad with shelter types 1 and 2, very similar here. Notes now match the PAS requirements, patch requirements. Material key added. Hatching shown. For the driveway transverse slope grading, some changes here. We have the transition length at 10 feet. That match the 10-foot transition on the, and slopes on the departure are shown on the approach. It was added. And here's the new sheet. This is the temporary pedestrian pathway. It's great to see this make it into the standard details. I still remember years ago when Adam first came to me about putting in temporary pedestrian paths around bridge projects. And at that time, it was unheard of, you know, and it's been great to see Delaware push forward and to see this go into to be a standard detail, obviously something that's very important. The new details based on section 301 of the standard specifications. Moving on, I know you guys are, thank you for hanging in here. It's a tough subject, but we're getting through it. We're on section 7 now, we're moving a little bit ahead of schedule. So some of the revised standard details here, we have 4 of them that were revised. So first is the slab plan with dowels and tie locations, and some pretty important things here. With the slab length changed from 20 feet to 15 feet. So that's a pretty important change. And added note 6, so curb without gutter will require type 4 polyurethane bonded recycled rubber expansion material between the face of the curb and the edge of PCC tape. Probably something maybe you recognize from the earlier curb and gutter details of your shown. So just to be consistent with that. The joint and sealant details change. Used to be multiple different details, and now everything has been consolidated. So added dimension, 1/4 inch width. There used to be a backer rod in here. And here's the page 3 of 5 with it. So there used to be a transverse one and a longitudinal one, and now there's just one detail. And it's filled with hot poured joint seal. Again, the 1/4 inch width for all joints, and remove the initial saw cut. So before there was a thinner initial saw cut, and then the joint was made bigger with a second cut, and via backer rods. All that was just been greatly simplified. Also added the Dalbar chart. Standard P-4 permanent crossroad patch over the pipe trench. So here we added bedding below the pipe. Reference DGM 1-20 for minimum cover, which depends on your pipe type. And labeled joints, saw cut and seal. So over top of those, we just want to make sure that all the joints are properly constructed. Pavement safety. So the final wearing surface, you see note 2, we added the file, that reference. We also added to the chart the bituminous concrete pavement final wearing course greater than 1 1/4 inches. Revised note 1. And then added note 2, which you see we referenced above. It gives them a little bit of play from 26 degrees to 40 degrees for the angle for the safety. And now we're to the last section, section 8 on traffic, and we're tracking well ahead of schedule. The revised standard details. So first of all, there's a new one, T1, the conduit junction well type 7. And then the revised ones, T4, T5, and T9. There were a number of them that were removed. Of note, T3, the conduit junction well type 3, or type 2, junction wells 11, 14, and 15 were removed. Special pole bases were removed. Detail currently in review for T7 and T13, conduit junction well type 7. Conduit junction wells were relocated, edits made to type 7. So these are the ones we're going to talk about, but there are also additionally a number of standards added to this, which we are not going to talk about. And they're here. And so it's the attachment between the poles, permanent wood barricade, electrical service pedestal, pedestrian push button location, and pedestrian push button location sign attachment. So assembly location pole sign. And we're not going to go over those, but those are all new standard details. Okay.
Keeps doing that.
Hang on 1 second, just having a screen glitch here. Okay, so the conduit junction well type 7, this is the new sheet I was referring to. It's sheet 404. So in note 4 was added to all conduit junction wells. It says the area around the junction well shall be backfilled with borrowed type C material to the required elevation in accordance with section 2 and 7. Excess and unsuitable material shall be disposed per section 106. The cabinet bases type M, K, and F. So the base was increased to 84 inches. Notes have been revised. And we added a K cabinet base to this. Again, cabinet bases type P and R, base increased to 84 inches. and change section B-B to remove the concrete. And again, revise notes in the bottom. Pull bases, typical section installation. So the bolt height varies in accordance to note 6, and note 6 is a new note. There it is right there. Added notes to base 6. Added typical installation view to it as well. And for base 4A and 4B, updated bolt sizes. For the wiring installation typicals, the loop detector and saw cut typical. You'll see, so the angle, this was never provided before, so angle is saw cut provided. Added note 5 here. And then finally, the wiring installation typicals and typical intersection layout. Lane assignments have been adjusted for the west and eastbound directions. More wiring installation typicals. Added conductor cable color orange. And that brings us to the end of this session. I'm going to turn it back over to Oz. Like I said earlier with the specifications, I know sometimes this stuff can be, it's not as interesting as some of the other things, but it is absolutely important. Standard details are part of your contract documents. You need to know them just as importantly as you need to know the standard specifications, and a lot of work went into revising. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Oz.
Thank you, Barry. So first want to take a moment just to thank Barry, Adam, Mike for participating with the presentation. And also thank everyone for getting the assisting with the specifications and details. There was a lot of folks that were involved that got us to where we are. Now we've had some good questions. I think everyone can see the questions and answers that have been asked thus far within the presentation. And some of them include a lot this afternoon on the details, the barriers, and notes. What's the interpretation? Trying to make sure that we got all the information out there. So there's definitely something that we do need to read the specification, refer to the details, and also refer to the notes within the details as well. So hopefully we've gotten that information along. This is just a brief introduction to everything that we've done and all the changes that were presented to try to make improvement, make it more constructability of what's actually being used. A couple examples that we have is a question that was asked about 202 for excavation. Is 209 paid separately? If the material brought in on site, it should be paid separately. 601 is for the material of the pipe, paying for the material of the pipe. So I know there were some other versions of the 601 that was in the older spec version with what was included, what was not included. So we just want to make sure that we read through what we have here and present it accordingly. Moving forward, in the memo that can be found online to kind of all presenters is just a generic, again, brief executive summary of what was done in the details, what was done for the specifications, and allow us to at least introduce that part. It also has an important section on the bottom for ourselves for design, is that if it's at semi-final on or before November 1st of this year, if it hasn't reached that point, then we need to 2020 specs for those particular plans. Danny's done a fantastic job on trying to make sure that we may have changed item description to meet the needs of what the description was, but we did not add or delete, or I'm sorry, we did not delete or replace items based off of an update. So we may have deleted it and then added a new one, but we tried not to just arbitrarily rename. So some of the ones in there may not chronologically work, but keeping the numbers the same was of more importance than chronological order. Some of the questions and details were asked, MUTCD references, Adams answered quite a bit of those. And the last question that was asked is, will we be posting this? We're going to try to post this on the website because everything has been recorded. It's going to be posted on the DRC. So same spot we have for the winter workshop and trainings that we have there. So it'd be the left side of the screen, kind of column down for the training portions of it. In the details, we do have a tracker that was placed in the 2020 details on the website that will allow you to kind of go through and all pretty much highlight the changes that were made for the detail sheets as Barry went over today. One of the things that we would like to point out is that the 2020, the title block was changed. So that's one way to notice it. And there's also a note in there that the bottom right corner gives you the latest date for that particular detail. For instance, we've had one detail that has thus, even though it's been posted, we had to reprint it because it was a need for the compliancy to MASH. It was a brief note description that needed to be changed. So if something like that has to occur and needs immediate action, and it is something that is more safety related, then we want to go ahead and get that out there and get that posted as soon as possible. There's a combination of the single page that would be updated. It'd be also the entire document would be updated, and it will all be posted on the website and kind of gives you a revised date on there. So if there was something that was done, it was done intentionally to and make that change, we made that note. All the rest of them are all generic for what the date of the details as they are throughout. So I know we're wrapping up a little bit early this afternoon. And like we said, we can go through most of the questions and answers that are posted. I've received a few emails that I can kind of briefly get into, is like the 202 aspect of it. There would be a need to bring sources of material in. And so if we're bringing the source of material in, then we're gonna have to pay for that source of material. Is 202 still 150%? Yes. If it's not a contract item, if it's bid, then no, it would be a bid item. We added 20904 for small quantities. A couple questions that were asked on the materials, such as the concrete itself. Some of the concentration was if it was ambient temperature versus material temperatures. So we labeled the ambient temperatures. If it is for air versus the material itself. So there's some reliance on the actual material meeting maximum temperatures of 5 degrees for concrete, and correct me if I'm wrong on that matter. But we want to make sure that we don't exceed the material itself, and then we have a flash and the concrete no longer is going to function or doesn't come out of the truck. That would be worse. Joints on curb, we have a minimum and maximum amount. It doesn't neglect the fact that we need to follow the pavement that it's adjacent to or the sidewalk that it's adjacent to. But if it comes down to pavement or sidewalk, we need to follow the pavement. It's going to find its own way if we don't, concrete will crack and it will project through from one adjacent product to another. So we want to make sure that we don't limit ourselves to, we can only do one thing. We have to apply in the field what's being done. So if you're going through a curve and you're on the inside of a curve and the radius reduces your joints, then, follow the roadway, follow what needs to be out there. So we got to apply some flexibility to that point. And the sections of 10 to 4 is just trying to give you a maximum amount that we're trying to achieve. We still need to relieve points. We don't want 20 feet, 30 feet. Make sure that we put the cuts in there. We get the control for everything. Let's see. And any other major questions or concerns? I'm looking to the room. So we'll leave the Q&A open. It's 2:45. Please feel free to ask any questions. We'll leave it open for another until maybe 5 minutes after 3, and try to fill any of those questions in. This will all be available, recorded online. I do appreciate everyone's attention. I appreciate everyone's participation, and hopefully we can get this out, get it used, and applied. Thank you.